And when you work in software engineering, no human being has half as good a memory as they think they do. And programmers know that because every oops we make is right there in the code and nobody else touched it. So this blunder has to be us. I don't remember making it, but there it is. It's my code. I must have been that dumb. It's a good place to go to get some humility about your memory.
Uh,
See, look at the pained expression on Donald's face. He knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, the first few years, I could remember all the code I'd ever written very vividly. But the next 40 years, I didn't do nearly so well. There's a long period of who did this?
Who wrote this crap? Oh no, I think it's me.
oh yeah.
Well, that is one of the things that I learned is that if you're not feeling well or you're tired or something, even if there's a lot of pressure,
Don't do it.
don't touch your code.
Don't do it.
you know,
You will
you
move
will,
farther away from the deadline.
yeah,
I mean, it's just amazing the things that I remember, and I think I'm remembering it pretty clearly when I was 10 years old. And then things that I don't remember what I did 50, when I was 50 years old or 50. It's like, what
Yeah,
happened to that brain? It's
it's a
like,
mystery.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, and what Donald was alluding to there was even worse than memory. He's talking about your thought processes. If you're sick, if you've got the flu, or you're stressed at home, or any number, if you are not just right when you sit down to code, you can write the stupidest, most tortured code, and then later you come back and go, "What was I thinking?" It's not even a function of memory. It's like there's my deranged thought processes captured for everyone to see in this tortured algorithm. Why did that make sense?
that's right. You know, to get code right requires great clarity and precision of thought. And I found I didn't always have that. And I could take perfectly good code, look at it, pronounce it to be crap, proceed to destroy it, or or like you already said, just start out and write brand new gibberish, you
Yes,
know? So
yes.
it's like you wait to get in that right frame of mind, and then things go very fast, very well, no problems. Well, I'm glad I'm it's all behind me now. I would
Except in your nightmares.
oh, but like this efficiency. We had at one point I worked for a company, that software company that was we were on our way out. But they took, the GE model, and they said, we'll totem pole everybody and we'll get rid of the bottom 10%, and that'll make things better. And it really did. The first time they did it, they actually correctly identified people that had not worked in years and got rid of them, or people who obstructed other people from working. And you got a real bonus when you did that. But by the third year,
Yes.
they were just destroying the company.
They're cutting people who are productive.
They were, well, and people who were really productive said management has gone crazy, and they just left. So in the end, they totally lost control of the workforce. They couldn't retain the high end. They had fired the low end, and they were sort of left with the middling mediocre in the middle, and could no longer do really good stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, they could do stuff. They could do maintenance and support. I mean, but the the brains were gone. It's just amazing,
Yeah.
that you can repeat the same process and it works well, and then it fails.
Yes.
And
That's Hegelian history right there. That's the
Right.
model.
Well, it's
It worked at first. Why isn't it working it now? I
but
keep
it's a
things.
popular management strategy
It is.
until when you fire the bottom 10%, the top 10% take a look around and say, I don't think I should be here either. And then you do that 2, 3, 4 years in a row. You're not left with a lot.
Yeah. It's
So
it's interesting. It's although it's a very technical profession that Donald and I are in, there are enormous opportunities to get philosophical insights if you're alive to what's happening. Because issues of thought processes and memory, the difference between being mentally alive to what's happening as opposed to just mechanically slamming out programs of like Donald was describing, we have this algorithm for how we're going to fix the company and not noticing when it stops working. All that stuff is available even in a technical profession as opportunities to get philosophical insight. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. This week I was putting up that argument about, say, documents like Q. And, you look at that initial bit in the Gospel of St. Luke. Now, he's claiming there were a mass of documents, generally not of great quality. And yet, the scholarly world acts as like the whole Christian assembly in the Mediterranean in those earlier years. Well, they only produce one document we don't have, and they call it Q. Mark saying there was a whole load of scribbles, and you can imagine the quality of some of the scribbles was pretty bad. You would have had actual witnesses visiting churches and saying, yeah, I remember Jesus walking on water. And then somebody would have written it down. You would have had, oh, yep, Jesus walked on water. This is the gospel according to Harry. It's probably only so long, it just has a little bit of information, and you'd be, if you were Luke, later on, you're trying to sift through all this stuff to find something of value. Is this real? Is this true? Now, he, like Matthew, was trying to make a large, succinct sort of work against what he seems to be claiming was a massive material, which wasn't very scholarly. Another aspect that I've always wondered about, and David Miller worships Zarathustra, but Zarathustra. It's always bugged me that the Medes or the Iranians were a collection of thugs at the time. They didn't have much in the way of high-end civilization. They were cowboys. They would have been going to towns and shooting them up. They weren't into, abstract religious doctrine so much. To me, it's pretty obvious that what they call the works of Zarathustra had its inspiration probably in places like Babylon. There, they've got enormous amounts of experts, mad astrologer priests, large amounts of individuals we would call demi-philosophers who sat around much of the day thinking up screwy ideas. Of course, you think up some good ones occasionally along with all the screwy ideas. It's always bugged me, the story of Zarathustra. They create this romantic legend, he's living somewhere out there in the Badlands. He has a bit of a suffering in his life. His girlfriend gets murdered, and suddenly the light bulb appears above his head. Well, look, in the Badlands, even if the light bulb appeared, you'd probably get cut down pretty quickly when you've got a light shining above your head. But there was a lot of Iranian, when you see all these illustrations of these, horsemen in the Assyrian army, and the Babylonian army, you wouldn't have raised them from a native population around the cities of Babylon and Ashur. These people were, they're barbarians that had been hired. Babylonia had the money, had the food, had the expertise. But when it came to a warrior mentality, most of the population know barbarians make the great warriors. So civilizations will hire barbarians to be their soldiers, typically. So when you see all these Assyrian and Babylonian horsemen and charioteers, you can be pretty sure that they were people like the Scythians or the Iranians who were, thugs for hire. But the whole thing is, I would say it was in Babylon, is actually a place where you start to see the creation of a universal deity. They were promoting Ashur Marduk as a universal deity throughout the empire. Now, oddly enough, the Hebrews first start thinking in terms of a universal deity during the Babylonian captivity. Who did they get the idea from? Who did Zarathustra get the idea from? They were copycats. There's something about Zarathustra which has always stuck in my throat. I can't imagine him creating that very complex ideology from a population like the Iranians at the time. This is the work of a huge city full of abstract thinkers. I'll see I've set the cogs in motion.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I gotta do more reading. It's been 30 years since I read about the origins of Zoroastrianism. So I'm woefully out of date. Um, but certainly the idea that there was an enormous amount of cross-pollination, what you're suggesting is there have been a lot of scholarly studies into this recently, and I mean like the last 60 years. So I have two books in my bookshelf downstairs that trace whether Heraclitus was influenced by Lao Tzu, by Taoism, or vice versa. Was there some, transmission across the Silk Road? And there's a third one I need to track down. I have the title for, but I don't have a
This was
copy.
the one-dimensional thinking, which was an improvement on the zero-dimensional thinking.
Exactly, exactly right. And it's striking that opposite ends of the Silk Road simultaneously within about a century of each other came up with the same innovation out of zero-dimensional thinking and into one-dimensional thinking. And both of these books basically analyze the parallels and go, what are the odds that all these features of Taoism and all these features of Heracliteanism would have arisen by coincidence at exactly the same time? And it's like, it is probably cross-pollination. And each theorist has their favorite idea about which way it went. But, these days, who knows?
So nothing in particular is an evil. Evil is a type of imbalance.
Mm,
If you go too much one way or too much the other way, there's no little nail in the fulcrum somewhere that's nailed down what is good.
right,
It can never be. You're
right.
in this constant state of balancing out different forces.
Yes, yes. And that's the classical perspective. But now we're about to launch into our seminar today, aren't we? So we will shift the definition of evil away from the classical and towards the medieval, and we'll dig into things. So for those just joining us, whether on the live stream, on the YouTube, or whether you're here live for the first time. It's 20 minutes after every earthly hour, Sophrosune time to get this not a show on the road for our weekly reminder that Heraclitus admonishes Homo sapiens that sophronein arete megiste. That is, sophron is the greatest arete, especially for we who lack sophrosune, who need anthropoculture. But hello, what is sophron? What is arete? What is sophrosune? Well, that's why we're here every week, a few minutes after each appointed hour. Speaking of hello, friends. Welcome back to the Kenneth Smith Seminar, where, alas, we do engage in zero-dimensional thinking, but we're trying to learn not to. To err is human, and to criticize everyone but ourselves is mere sophistry. And we don't want to make the baby Socrates cry, now do we? So may we mend our ways, set healthy boundaries, and get to work. It's time to give ourselves not something new to think about, but something new to think with. As Kenneth Smith says, that's what philosophy does. Hello, I'm your moderator, Rick Marshall, with the 180th weekly installment of our long-running seminar about Smith's existentialist philosophy book, Millennia in Microcosm, in which he explores how to escape the trap of our cognitive illusions. Daedalus foolishly built the labyrinth that trapped him, and so have we, by the law of unintended consequences that haunts all mortal minds. Wily coyotes, we are flattened by our own schematic thinking, but now it's time to wake up, think in new dimensions, and arise from our flat Procrustean beds. In his book, Smith guides us through the alien worldviews of the ancients and medievals to learn to see the world through their eyes. As we see truths about the world that they couldn't, so they see truths or saw truths that we can't. We explored the ancients together for 2 years. Now we're a year and a half into exploring the medievals, where a new kingdom of the spirit will end up struggling against an opportunist, genocidal religious empire erected in its name. By the end of this book, Smith will bring us back to modernity to see it for the first time, not as the obvious truth we've always assumed, but as the weird, parochial, partly helpful, partly harmful perspective it actually is. When we learn to shift among these worldviews, for the first time, we'll have a little meaningful freedom to question what we assume, to appreciate alien worldviews and their insights. When last we left our intrepid heroes, we were in paragraph 3 of chapter 9. There's a link in the chat. If any of you joined after I shared it, just ping me in the chat and I'll share it again. All the text that we're going through, all the Kenneth Smith text we're going through in the second half of today's seminar is there. The text from the first half is coming from a book by Burton Mack, who wrote the New Testament, in which Burton Mack attempts to walk us through not his own opinions about the origins of early Christianity, but what is the consensus among biblical scholars. That there isn't a hive mind, so it's not something that nobody will disagree with, but what a 90% of biblical scholars agree with. So it's based on the idea that biblical scholars have their own shared understanding of the Bible and where it came from that's largely unknown to the general population, including unknown to most preachers and most, devout churchgoers. And the purpose of this book, Who Wrote the New Testament, is to try to bring everybody up to date with where Bible scholarship has been in recent decades. We're using that to talk about early Christianity. This puts us in the middle of a 3-year arc about medieval civilization and its worldview. To be in paragraph 3 of chapter 9. For the rest of this arc, we're augmenting Smith's text with primary source materials so medieval and proto-medieval thinkers can speak to us. We began with the early Christian sayings tradition. First, we did the Gospel of Thomas, and then we did the Q source, and last week we finished going through the early pre-Pauline Christ cult fragments that Paul preserves in his letters. And thank you, Paul, for being so diligent about that. You gave us a little view into the decade before you began working. Without that, we might not have anything. It might just be a dark decade at a critical time. But now, this week, we begin our 4th segment of primary source materials, and it's going to be Paul. We'll do an intro to Paul and his perspective today. This seminar is organized by the reserved and thoughtful David Roel. There he is. If you look at the attendees, he's right there, but he almost never tells us what he's thinking. But we know he's thinking something. He's reserved and thoughtful. He writes each week's capsule summaries. He arranges these invites on Meetup. He records and live streams. He posts on YouTube. None of this could happen without him. This week, the summary that he wrote is the following. Capitalism, scientism, and Christendom each manufacture artificial forms of deprivation, material, intellectual, and moral, by conditioning people to mistake narrow, imposed perspectives for necessity, knowledge, or righteousness. It contends that modern Christian parochialism is a deliberately engineered closed-mindedness that blends superficial sophistication with deep ignorance, enforcing boundaries of forbidden knowledge through self-righteous censorship rather than innocent provincialism. I'm just going to drop that in there. This is David Royal's summary of the material that we're going to see in Kenneth Smith's paragraphs 3 and 4 of chapter 9. We will be debating and discussing as we go, but not debate, because this seminar is no show, no debate, no logic puzzle, no attempt to transmit dogmatic philosophical systems. We are an existentialist philosophical book club. Kenneth Smith is a full-time philosopher, once a philosophy professor who writes in a dense, allusive style that refers to other writers and artists to bring them into the conversation. So together, we explore all those tangents and allusions in his main text. And we add our own perspectives into the mix for a rich, patient conversation, not to win, but to philosophize together. Phew! I update and cut that intro a little more each week. By the time we finish 3.5 years from now, maybe it will be just right. I'm still working on. We've had 3-hour seminars where we spent the entire 3 hours just bringing people up to date. Because I mean, after all, 180 sessions. We've been doing this for a while. So this is our attempt at a capsule summary. Anytime anybody new to this has questions, comments, or concerns, just raise your hand. We'll call on you and we can talk about it. We're always happy to go back to the earlier material because the way that Kenneth writes, he is trying to use the earlier material to illuminate the later material. So it's never off topic to veer back and talk about some core concept like sophron, like arete, like sophrosune. So with that out of the way, let's begin by diving back into the early Jesus movement. That's where we are. As we've said before, there are many strands to these early Jesus movements. Hardly any of the strands are documented. This is what Stephen was alluding to before we began, when he said, Luke and Mark, they reference the enormous volume of materials that they had to sift through before they wrote their accounts, and most of that was left by the wayside. All we have is this indirect evidence, such as what Stephen was citing, and fragments, whether they're captured within Luke and Matthew, as in the case of the Q material, whether they're captured in Paul's letters when he does direct quotes of the things that he was taught before he began his ministry, or sometimes we luck out. Like when at Nag Hammadi, we found the clay jars, and in one of them was the Gospel of Thomas, an early sayings document, which we knew existed, but we never really had any part of until somebody just stumbled upon it. Every so often we get these little fragments. We don't pretend that on the seminar we're going to go through all of the varieties of early Christianity there were. None of us knows anymore. All that we know, like Stephen was suggesting, all that we know is that there's a lot more than we think there were. They started out enormously different from each other. Some of them clearly had never even heard of each other. Some of them had and had struggles with each other. Paul writes about some of that. So all we know is that we're getting a little sampler of a much larger, richer picture. By the time we finish this survey of the strands that we have evidence for, which ended up braided together and reconciled, we'll see a lot of them. We're proceeding a step at a time to take as close a look as we can at each one, given the evidence left to us, such as it is. Each of the strands we have evidence for is going to get its attention. We know that's going to include would-be prophets, apocalyptics, and by the way, for Stephen, we are finally getting into some of the apocalyptic sections. Thank goodness. Which is important because it is another very early strand, as Stephen said in a presentation he gave about a month and a half ago, and here we are. We're finally getting to it this week, next week, week after. Exorcists, proclaimers, miracle workers, passion narrators, secret meaning puzzlers, Gnostics, and so on. So many varieties, and yeah, there were fragments of Thomas found before Nag Hammadi. That is an important point. Thank you. And it's part of how we knew that the document found at Nag Hammadi was Thomas, is because the fragments we'd found before are in that. So we had Greek fragments. So I think in the Oxyrhynchus documents. Anybody who's never looked at Oxyrhynchus, you really want to. Oxyrhynchus is a dump. It's a dump. It is a fossilized trash heap in which people dumped all kinds of stuff. And so yes, there are fragments of from the New Testament in there. Whether it's somebody threw out their worn out copy of a book, or somebody converted to some other religion and quickly had to dispose of the evidence they used to be Christians. There are Jewish texts in there. There are there are receipts and grocery lists in there. There are little fragments of court cases. They may be digging through this thing for another 100 years or more. They're going through it as at a pace. They're trying desperately not to destroy what's in the junk, the trash pile. They're trying to tease out all these fragments and to figure out what they say. And you never know when 1 month, suddenly there's going to be a big announcement and they found a whole new book of the Bible, or a whole new book of the Tanakh, or an alternative version of Luke. I mean, the Oxyrhynchus is just periodically has these little explosions. So we had these Greek fragments of Thomas from Oxyrhynchus before we found the Nag Hammadi Coptic copies of Thomas. Anyway, so we went through those together, and we're gonna go through all these different variants. So we did three and recovered. We did the Thomas sayings, we did the Q sayings, we did the 7 pre-Pauline Christ cult fragments that Paul preserved. I'm going to drop them into the chat now, not to go through them. We already did that, but just as a reminder, because Paul swears up and down that these fragments he is trying to be true to. And every other thing he writes and every other thing he does, he's not trying to transform the Christ cult he was introduced to. He's trying to actually, serve it authentically. So these fragments are very important to Paul. These seven fragments. So here they are. Here's the first one, and this is perhaps the earliest. And this is a version in which the only thing that we know about Jesus' death is that he lived such a faithful life, such a righteous life, that God has decided to allow Gentiles to sit down at meals with Jews. He's decided that they're not sinners. Jesus was such a non-sinner that all these people who follow Jesus, they're allowed in the door, and we can have these cosmopolitan communities together in Galilee, and it's okay. The Jews aren't doing anything wrong by sitting down and breaking bread with the Gentiles. That's a very early stage of these Jesus movements. Then we have 1 Corinthians, where we're talking about the early stages, again, early stages, but later than Romans, early stages of the what we do together, what the early Jesus movement did together when they would gather together for meals, the things they would say at the beginning and the things they would say at the end. And once again, we see all kinds of things are missing. Neither of these two fragments mentions Christ at all. And the first one doesn't mention Jesus as being any kind of a Lord. He's just a faithful dude. Who lived an exemplary life. But by the second time, Jesus is a kind of Lord over the emerging kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven, that these communities are trying to form by gathering together regularly and treating each other not according to Roman law or Greek law or Jewish law, but according to what they imagine to be the rightful kingdom to come. And that what they're doing has an apocalyptic quality, because they believe they are bringing about the end of the current world order, one meal at a time, one gathering at a time, one community at a time, by living according to the world to come and not the world that they're in. It is a way in which they're turning away from the corruption of politics and religion. Then we have the kerygma in 1 Corinthians. This is central to Paul, and it's got, as Burton Mack points out, the 4 critical verbs: died, buried, raised, appeared. This is the core of the recipe for Paul. And now we have the first appearance of the name Christ, the anointed. And as we talked about last week, this is not the first time that we see the reference to people being anointed. In the Tanakh, there are 2 people who are anointed. And one of them is the Persian who allowed the Jews to return back home. He was called Christ and the anointed. That is to say, he's a servant of God. And also, I believe, is it David? Is it David, the other one? I think it's David. Ari would probably remember. So Christ, the use of Christ as a term for Jesus comes from an old Jewish tradition, and it's interesting to see who the other 2 people are that they're comparing him to. And in this case, it might be thought of that the purpose for the early Christians, not for later Christians, but for the early Christians, that the reason you call him Christ is because of that Romans quote. It allows the Gentiles in the door to be, to be non-sinners, that they don't have to follow Jewish law because Jesus did it for them. And now they can come together and be part of a holy community. That this is a kind of coming home, and that's the kind of sense in which of Christ that they had originally. Uh, yes, salvation from the crucifixion is, we're going to get into that, right? In Paul's letters, this is going to become a major point. But in the early version, what Paul's quoting there isn't a salvation in the sense of, from original sin, from Eve, or from avoiding hell. All of that part was added later. What we see in these fragments is just, can we form this community together, Jews and Gentiles? And this is the kind of salvation that that Jesus' death is making possible, according to Paul. All right, so then we have in Galatians this fragment that really emphasizes the Galilean context, right? Where you've got all these people, you've got Jews, you've got Greeks, you've got Persians, you've got Babylonians, you've got Egyptians, you've got people from all over the place living side by side on these trade routes that pass through Galilee, and you've got all these grape growers, you've got all these carpenters, you've got all these fishermen, you've got all these, you don't have any big cities, but you have all of these symposia, these clubs that are being formed by people who have been uprooted from their cultures, uprooted from the old temple states, which were smashed by Alexander, and they don't find themselves at home in the Roman Empire. They don't find themselves at home even in its predecessors, the Ptolemaic or Seleucid kingdoms. None of those things are offering them any place to ground their value system. And so what they want to do is form these symposia and get together with other people who are from all different parts of the empire and talk about their values. How should we treat one another? What should the kingdom of God look like? How are we going to bring it about? And in Galatians, we see this idea that through his death and through what was the word, expiation, the making righteousness that Jesus' death caused, that now we shed our old parochial tribalisms, even down to whether we're slave or free, which is fundamental to the classical world, and even older than that, down to whether we're male and female. And we say what we are is we're part of the brotherhood of man. We're part of this new thing that we're going to create that is universal for the first time. Not a God of the Jews, not a God of the Romans, but a God that could be a God above all those gods for everybody. And the pre-Pauline Christianity does some clever tap dancing around, if Jesus is Lord in that sense of being above the other gods, he's not really above the Jewish God. The Jewish God is allowing him to sit at his side and be over all the other gods. There's some interesting, threading the needle that we're gonna run into in Paul. Then the last several bits, I think that was 4 of them there. Let's do the last 3. This one is the Christ hymn from Philippians. We spent a whole week on this one. And this one is it's got this interesting chiasmic structure in which in the first stanza Jesus begins as a god. Before he's even born, he begins as a god, which is in opposition to all the earlier fragments. This is a new development. He starts out as a god and he decides that that's not worthy. And what he wants to do is reduce himself to the likeness of mankind and be like a slave and humble himself and be obedient and even die, which a god can't really do, but he wants to do those things. And in return for being willing to lower himself, God exalts him and raises him up and puts his name above every name, and every tongue on the world can confess he's now Lord of the newly emerging kingdom of God that we're all creating together by getting together and having dinner and talking about ethics and how we should treat one another. So the transformation from Jesus the teacher to Jesus the God, to Jesus the God of all gods, it's an astonishing transformation that happens in like 17 years. No, it must be more like 7 years, as we'll see today. Paul spent a bunch of time thinking before he began his ministry. All right, so Galatians. We go back to Galatians and we see this little prayer: grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Notice that we've now got Lord and Jesus and Christ all together, just like we did in the Christ hymn. We're fine. Before that, we might have Jesus, we might have Lord Jesus, we might have Christ, we might have Christ Jesus, but we didn't have Lord Jesus Christ. It's all coming together here in these fragments in Philippians and Galatians. Who gave himself for our sins. And of course, as Burton Mack points out, this is not sins in the sense of Adam and Eve and hell and all that. That's all, they come up with that later. This is sins in the sense of non-compliance with the law of the Torah, right? The deliverance is the deliverance to be allowed into the holy community with the Jews who are assumed to already be there. And that's because these symposia are interest clubs. People fed up with the Roman Empire are looking for an alternative. They look at Judaism and they say, this looks very interesting. You guys have been at this for a long time. You seem to have your act together. How do we join? And the Jews are all looking at each other going, well, you're not Jews. So, uh, and as we'll see, Paul plays a critical role in answering that question. What are the Jews supposed to do with all these weird fan clubs that are gathering around them? So this fragment in Galatians is saying, Jesus basically gave himself to redeem us from our inability to join these clubs, these communities, and be part of this religious community with the Jews, to set us free from the present evil age, i.e., the corruption of Rome, the corruption of Alexander, and all the others. But he doesn't do it above the Jewish God. He does it according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. So here's some of the tap dancing we're talking about. On the one hand, Jesus is above all the other gods, but we're not saying he's above the Jewish God. We're saying the Jewish God lifted him up by his side. And you notice there's no Trinity here, right? It's going to come much, much, much later. The Trinity is not part of any of the original writings. At this point, we have a father-son relationship. And in the fragments we've just gone through in the last few minutes, they didn't start out with anything like father-son. I mean, in that Romans fragment at the beginning, nothing suggests that Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus was this guy, and God's looking around going, wow, that guy's really righteous. He's really faithful. That's cool. I honor that. And that was the relationship. But by this point, he's become the son of Yahweh, effectively, in Galatians 1:3-5. All right. And then our last fragment. And this is from 2 Corinthians. Which we'll spend some time talking about 2 Corinthians in the weeks to come. But now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And so here we're talking again, this ties us back all the way to the first fragment and to the discussions we had before we even began these fragments. When we were talking about how Jesus' own teachings, based on the sayings, appear to have arisen out of the old wisdom movement, the Hellenistic wisdom movement, like the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics. You have these wandering preachers who are trying to get people to stop taking for granted the lives that they're leading under this kind of corrupt system that's around them. And what people were doing, what educated people were doing in the course of learning from great thinkers of the past is first they would study the writings of those thinkers, then they would have to copy them onto new manuscripts, right? They're part of the manuscript transmission tradition. The good students, their copies would be kept and put into libraries or shared around, because old scrolls wear out, right? And then to graduate from studying Epicurus, you had to be able to write on a new topic that Epicurus never encountered. But because you've copied so much of Epicurus and learned his character from his writings, you should now be able to role play. What would Epicurus do in this new situation? And you're being evaluated on how accurately you are recreating the character of Epicurus, keeping the character of Epicurus alive through your ability to write new things that are exactly, as far as your teacher can tell, they're exactly what Epicurus would in fact have said. And this is very much like when people do fan fiction. And you can tell if somebody gets Spock wrong. Spock's laughing and giggling and getting drunk, and people are going, nope, nope, you have not figured out Spock. That is not his character. or Dr. McCoy starts going, this is not logical. And people are going, nope, nope, you've botched Dr. McCoy. You don't have the character right. You have to understand the character well enough to really feel who that person was and how they saw the world and recreate it in new situations. This is how they're all trained. This is how Paul was trained. Any educated Greek or Roman who went through the Hellenistic school system went through that process of learning. So when you were studying Epicurus, you were partly learning how to bring Epicurus's character within your own character. And that's effectively, as we said last week, what Kenneth Smith is doing in this entire book. Except he's not trying to put his character into us. He's trying to get us to the point where we can understand the character of the ancients so well that we could write something or discuss something in the way that they would have. And now that we're in the medieval section, he's trying to do the same thing with the medievals. We want to get to the point where we can understand the medieval perspective so well that we could write what would a medieval say or how would they react to this new situation that they never encountered in the Middle Ages, some novel situation. And yet it has to be authentic. We have to be able to be possessed by, right? Enthusiasm, entheos. We talked about that some months back. We have to be able to be possessed by the character or the spirit of these great teachers before we could graduate. And we see evidence of that here in Corinthians, where this concept is, if we are living in a corrupt late Roman Empire, at this point, it's the early Roman Empire. We're living in a corrupt early Roman Empire. And we don't, I mean, as Burton Mack says, it has got to be the most unlovable empire that ever existed. It keeps the order, but it's brutal. You can't love it. There's nothing lovable about it. It's the mafia empire. And so you can't be filled with the spirit of that age because it's gross. You don't want to be filled with the spirit of that age. It's like a demon that's possessing you. And you can't be filled anymore with the spirit of the old temple states that Alexander smashed because they're gone. If you do, then you have a spirit without a political economy to plug into. You're aimless, like some kind of living ghost. So this is the problem they're all trying to solve. And the solution is that Jesus can help you drive out the evil spirit of the age and replace it with the spirit of the Lord, Jesus' own spirit. Jesus, who was the most faithful, who was, unto God, who was the most righteous, who followed all the law of the Tanakh. His faithfulness and righteousness can become your faithfulness and righteousness if you dilate your soul to allow the Spirit to enter and transform your character. These relationships between possession and transformation, between character and spirit, this is very close to the heart of this marriage of Hellenism and Judaism that we're seeing in Galilee and that we're seeing in these early Christians. This is where the connect the dots is happening, where the aha experiences are happening that are leading people like Paul to go, oh my goodness, I think they're onto something here. I'm going to quit doing what I was doing and I want to do this instead. There's something important here. All right, so that was a quick run through, a recap of what we did before, and now we can dive into the Paul stuff. And I'm not going to do one of the epistles today. I'm going to wait for Sharon. And that's fine because I really wanted to spend some time on this subject today. Burton Mack talks us through some observations about Paul that include a refutation of something that I had been taking for granted for years, and that I've said on these calls before for years. And one of my purposes in these, to be philosophical is not to defend the position you have, right? To be philosophical is to be skeptical of the position you have. Knowing, and not just skeptical in a vague sense of, I don't know if I trust this guy, but to know in your heart that we carry around a bunch of bullshit, that we believe. An enormous amount of what we think is wrong. Any programmer will tell you, any experienced programmer will tell you that. And the way we know is we write software and it doesn't work. And we're like, I thought that would work. But unfortunately, I don't understand the problem as well as I think I do. There's garbage in my brain and I have to find it and get rid of it. So how do I do that? This is a philosophical goal. So I try to demonstrate that on these calls, and I'm going to do it again right now. I've done it before, and I'm going to do it again right now. I always thought, because it's a widespread position, that Paul was very focused on visions, and that he had lots of supernatural or out of body experiences in which he believed he was communing directly with Jesus and Jesus was telling him things. And I've picked that up from a lot of biblical, scholars. I mean, a lot of people write as though that's true. But Burton Mack says that's not actually the scholarly consensus. I mean, there are lots of scholars who think that, but you find it even more often in churches and in popular representations of Paul. And he says there's reasons, if you actually take Paul at his word, there's reasons to think that Paul actually doesn't say that he has visions, that Paul has insights, but that modern translators fiddle with the language when they translate to make it sound like Paul has visions, because they know, they believe, they were taught that Paul has visions. And so they need to alter the text to make it say that he has visions. And I'm going to take us through one example of that right now. It goes to a theme that Kenneth Smith talks about a lot, and that I bring up a lot, and that is the difficulty of translation. Burton Mack says, as Paul expressed it, his conversion was radical. He described it in terms of a revelation from God that Jesus was God's son, and as a call to take this message to the Gentiles. That's from Galatians 1:15-16. And what Mack says, it's very important to see that the revelation and the call were two ways of expressing a single change of mind. This isn't two different events. Says, unfortunately, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible continues a long tradition of sloppy translation by suggesting that God, quote, was pleased to reveal his son to me. Galatians 1:15-16. The Greek term that they're translating as to is en, which does not mean to. It means in or by means of, which means, according to the Greek language, not the translation, Paul was saying that God was pleased to make his son known by means of me, not to me. And this is a non-controversial thing. All biblical scholars who can read the Greek and are willing to take Paul at his word can see right there in the text, there isn't any version of the text in which it's using the preposition to. This line, which has always been translated into English to suggest that Paul had a revelation in which God, made Jesus known to Paul through a revelation. We've all heard that, we've all read that, and it's absolutely not what the book says. It's what the translation says. And what the book says clearly is that, God was content, was pleased to make Jesus known by means of Paul. That it was Paul's purpose. This is his calling. It's why the revelation is also a calling, that Paul is being called to spread the word about Jesus. And that's what this sentence means. Not, I was walking on the road to Damascus and I was struck with a vision. And this is a point that Burton Mack makes a lot in this first chapter about Paul. He says, pretty much no serious Bible scholar thinks that you could take any part of the book of Acts literally. He says you need to read the book of Acts exactly the way that you read the Greek myths. This is important to understanding the mythology of the people, what they believed, what they thought was important, their value system, the metaphors that they were using to understand things. But it's a terrible error to try to use any part of it as history. So we have no evidence that when Luke wrote Acts, he was writing any actual history that occurred. And when we say there's no evidence, we have more than that. We have evidence that it's not history. And the evidence is in Paul's letters. As we go through the letters, we're going to see over and over where Paul very clearly explains how he did things, and then Acts contradicts him. And Acts is written 80 years later. So who's more likely to be correct? The guy it happened to, or some guy writing generations later on? It's why the consensus is wherever Acts disagrees with Paul's letters, Acts is wrong. And if it's wrong so often, and it doesn't agree with Paul about much of anything, then why would we think that it's correct about the things for which we don't have any direct evidence? And the assessment, the general assessment is that the purpose of the book of Acts is very different from the old Jewish books of history, whose purpose was to try to capture and remember some piece of a people's history. That the purpose of Acts is to reconcile the different threads of early Christianity by creating a fake history in which they're all lovey-dovey and cozy and work together, and in which you have the apostolic succession that leads to the bishops. That's what Acts is for. And not for any of the reasons that we use it for. So Saul being struck down on the road to Damascus and becoming Paul because he sees a vision of Jesus saying, "Why are you persecuting my people?" And he goes, "Oh no, it's God. I think I will convert from Judaism to Christianity and now I will become its prophet." That's all Acts. Paul doesn't say any of that. So as far as if we take Paul at his word and assume that Paul is the expert about Paul's own life, none of that happened. That's not the way it happened at all. Which raises the question, what does Paul say? How did it happen? What does Paul think he's up to? If it's not the stuff that we all learned in Bible school, then and the good news is he tells us. Paul is a very clear writer. He pretty much just says what he means. As long as somebody isn't interpolating some later line 100 years later and inserting it into his letter with different grammar and vocabulary that Paul wouldn't have used, and we can spot those now because they don't match. As long as it's Paul's own text, he's usually pretty clear about this stuff. So what was Paul up to? This is what we want to talk about today. Is who's this? If Paul is not the guy from Acts and not the guy from Bible school, then who is he? And we're gonna piece it together. We'll spend the next hour piecing this together, and then we'll turn to Kenneth Smith's text. This is my plan for today. Before I dive in, questions, comments, or concerns? I'll pause. Okay, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so it's my observation that when we see the Greco-Roman world from about the 2nd century BC, there's an enormous change in values. We start to see a very authoritarian culture develop. Well, it had been authoritarian before that, but now it became really authoritarian. This was a culture in which the emperor spent a lot of time exiling philosophers when he was in a good mood. Or, you know, the Greek successors were doing the same thing. Ptolemy the Fat, who was ruler of Egypt, and they all ganged up on him and got rid of him. And then he came back. Ptolemy the Fat was back in town. And that little gang down the Great Library who stabbed him in the back, he didn't have much time for them at all. But this was a culture which developed vast material works. You know, you finally get to, stuff like the Colosseum being built later. The emperor, to show his greatness, is building material things. This starts to change in the 3rd century crisis. We actually see a philosopher like Plotinus having the ear of the emperor, because the emperor's going, everything's in a mess. I've got to find an answer. Have we displeased the gods? What's going on? And we see from that time onwards a return to a more spiritual interest. For example, the Academy of Athens, which had been closed down most of the time, was reopened in 410 when the great disaster of Rome being invaded, the city itself being taken over by barbarians occurs. They're looking for the answers from people they were banning before. But that whole period from 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD, I would describe great works of material. And in a time when people are distracted by externals, their spiritual culture generally tends to decline. which is exactly what's happening in America today and the West. We are heading into a very materialistic era. You thought you saw some materialism in the past. Well, every year that goes past, it gets worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to call on John in just a second, but I'm going to insert kind of where are we here? So in the timeline, Augustus died in the year 14 CE. Tiberius reigned from then until 37. So it's under Tiberius that Jesus dies and the early Christian movement begins. Well, not the early Christian movement, the early Jesus movements begin under Tiberius. And then we have Caligula until 41. What a treat he was. And then after that, it's Claudius until 54. So basically, the time that we're talking about between Jesus and when Paul first starts writing his letters we're talking the time of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. And anyone who knows the history of this, um, we have come a long way from Augustus. There's the Augustus created this image of stability, like the Roman Empire was going to be this very stable thing and very law and order. But very quickly we get into people who are succeeding through murder and conspiracy, assassinations. It's getting ugly and messy at this point. And very shortly after Paul, under Nero and his successors, it's going to get a lot hairier. But the kind of gross the replace under Augustus, you could maintain the fiction that the new empire was a renaissance, a revival of the value system of the Republic. Because Augustus just wouldn't shut up about it. He was really focused on it. He invested enormously in poets and writers and philosophers who would talk about that value system. But his successors are really not trying very hard to pretend that they're doing anything of the kind. They're increasingly becoming my fist is bigger than your fist, so you do what I say or I punch you in the face. The materialism that Stephen's talking about is increasingly evident as we move from the time of Jesus' death to the time that Paul begins writing. I want to agree with and underscore what Stephen said.
The spiritual movement in this case is coming from a gang of slaves.
Yes.
So we're led to believe.
Yes, it's certainly far outside the halls of power, shall we say. Thanks, Stephen. John, welcome to the call. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, Rick. Yeah, so I like that discussion on the history of the New Testament. And so what I noticed is that the Gospels, they say like don't search after a sign, right? You have Jesus saying that. And then like the first thing you hear about like in the books after the Gospels, I think it's one of the Acts, I'm not really sure, is they like can't make a decision, so they're like, we're gonna draw straws for it. And I'm like, isn't that directly searching after a sign? And to me, for so long, it was always like, what are they doing? Like, why aren't they doing what they're told to do? And then I kind of thought, like you're saying, these texts haven't communicated with each other. They don't know, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So that's what it is. So my question is, what documents can be trusted, like straightforward?
Oh, what a good question. I mean, isn't that the right question? And there are various positions on this, but we're following Burton Mack's lead right now, because Burton Mack is doing an unusual thing where he's in this book, who wrote the New Testament, he's not trying to grind his own axe. He's got separate books for that, and he tells you in those books that he's doing it. In this book, his whole focus is on kind of what is the general, if it's not a consensus, what's the majority opinion of biblical scholars? If you go to a biblical scholarship convention and you stand up in front of a room and you say this thing, what are the things that you can say that you aren't going to get people jumping up and down and yelling? You're mostly going to get a lot of people nodding among the experts in the audience, and that's what this book is trying to focus on, is kind of what is generally considered to be trustworthy. So the first thing to know is there's probably not a single book in the New Testament that hasn't been tampered with. And we know that because we've gotten much better at linguistics and textual analysis than the authors and the tamperers themselves were. We know things about how language changes over time. Grimm's Law, for example, which the Brothers Grimm, it's named after the Brothers Grimm and their studies of German over time. We know things about how language changes that nobody had discovered at the time that, Paul was writing, or at the time maybe 60 years later that somebody was trying to insert a line here or there into Paul. So they don't understand that you can't, insert into the Sermon of the Mount a line that says, "Blessed are the groovy, for they will get down with their funky selves." They don't understand that the slang they're familiar with didn't exist 3 decades before. They're living. They have this sense of language that is very snapshotted. Unless they're linguistic scholars, you can find occasional scholars among the Greeks and Romans who do know this and they write about it. But the most people, even most educated people, don't understand that how their language changes. So they don't know how to erase the fingerprints of their tampering. And the result is, biblical scholars will often agree about which lines in which letters of Paul couldn't possibly have been written by Paul. It's the wrong grammar, the wrong idiom. It refers to events that hadn't happened yet. And it is concerned with some major theological church issue that only became a church issue, say, in the 150s. And in the 50s, when Paul's writing, those churches didn't even have that structure. They might be arguing about, what is the job of a bishop. There wasn't a bishop in Paul's time. If Paul's talking about bishops and they better do this and they better not do that, well, somebody put that in there, right? And so an example is we'll get to it. In one of his letters, there's a bit where he's talking about the importance of women. He's saying women can be, incredibly important visionaries and leaders in the church. And he gives a list of like 6 women. Here's 6 women you should listen to. You list 1, 2, 3. And then in the middle of this list, there's a line that says, women should shut up and sit down and not try to be leaders and, let the men talk in church. And then it continues 4, 5, 6. And the traditional assumption is, well, Paul just says things as they occur to him and he's a disorganized writer. But the biblical scholars say, no, 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 no. That was a list of 6 things that somebody hated. Some scribe was writing this list, and the scribe was misogynistic. He was a male chauvinist pig, and he's seeing Paul saying that you should listen to women, and he's losing his top. And so he inserts a line of his own into the middle to fix Paul's theology to make it match what the theology is going to be 100 years after Paul, when women are being shut out of positions of power. But in Paul's day, they weren't. They were incredibly important, and Paul respected them. So through techniques like this, they're able to go through and sort of piece apart which lines in these probably weren't written by the original people. And then on top of that, they're able to figure out which letters are actually just not, they're entirely forgeries. They're not them at all. So the pastorals, for example, everyone's like, this is not Pauline theology at all. This is written much later. They're important documents, not for what they claim to be, but for the time period they were actually written in to tell you how the theology has changed since the time of Paul. So the general assessment is as follows. There are these fragments in Luke and Matthew that are widely believed to be, references to an old sayings document that would have been running around in the 40s, and that the authors of Luke and the authors of Matthew both had in their hands when they were writing their gospels. And those bits, give us some authentic picture of what the early Jesus movement was remembering Jesus as having said, in the 40s, 10 years after he's gone. That's probably an authentic picture of what they were thinking about. Likewise, the Thomas fragments from Oxyrhynchus, they sound, other than a few gospel inserts, Gnostic inserts here and there, most of the Thomas stuff sounds a lot like the Q stuff. In other words, it sounds like it's the authentic early Jesus movement, keeping the sayings of their teacher alive in little documents. And that was reinforced when they actually found a copy of it at Nag Hammadi, written in Coptic. So those probably give us an authentic picture into the Christianity of the 40s. And then Paul, like we just talked about for the last month, Paul has these 7 fragments that he's preserved. And we put them into the chat, that he says were what he was taught when he first began becoming a Christian. He was taught these things, and now he's reciting them verbatim inside of his own letters. And those are giving us a picture of a different Jesus movement in the 40s, before Paul started writing. And that Jesus movement is fairly different from the one that we see in Q. Now, the Gospel of Thomas itself, the copy we have, as Stephen points out, is from the 2nd century. That's why it's got some Gnostic stuff in it that's been added. But if you strip that stuff out, you get a picture back that goes back into the 40s. Paul himself, at least for the 7 authentic letters that most scholars agree were actually written by Paul. Once you strip out the interpolations, that gives us a pretty accurate picture of what Paul at least believed Christianity to be in the 50s when he was writing. So these are pretty good evidence. The next piece that we have, and we'll talk about it maybe in a couple of months from now when we finish up with Paul, is the Didache. I don't know if you know about the Didache, but I'm going to put the name in the text. There's a website that you want to look at. It's called Early Christian Writings, and it's a scholar has gone through and tracked down every reference to an early Christian writing, whether it's because we have the document or because some document we have refers to it. Like in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, some of these theologians are writing about, well, I have a copy of this and I have a copy of that. They might quote passages from some lost document that we don't have anymore, and that'll be listed on this Early Christian Writings website. Well, the Didache is there. It dates sometime between 50 to 120. My guess is somewhere in the 60s is probably where the Didache dates to. And it's anonymous. It doesn't say who it's by. And it's concerned with, how are we going to organize the church now that the first generation of Christians are dying? How's the second generation of Christianity supposed to survive after the first generation is gone? And that's probably a fairly accurate picture about what people were scratching their heads about and worried about in the 60s. But by the time you get to the Gospels, there's a lot of reason to think that the Gospels are deliberate constructs that are being done to make a theological or community organizational point. And so they can't be read the same way that you would read those earlier documents. They have to be read in terms of what are the intentions of the community that's behind this? What are they changing and why are they changing it? What are they leaving out and why are they leaving it out? What are they including and why are they including it? It becomes less a resource for understanding Jesus and more a resource for understanding what some of these different competing factions within early Christianity were worried about. And all the Gospels date to the time around the Roman invasion of Judea and the destruction of the temple. So they're products coming out of trauma and frustration, and it shows in all 4 of them. And of course, they don't agree with each other at all about what Jesus said and did.
Can I try
Yeah, go
to
ahead.
summarize real quick, just so I'm sure I'm following? So you're saying Matthew and Luke, they have some authentic info in them,
Some
but
fragments.
overall, they got some fragments, but overall, there's more fluff in the Gospels than there is authentic info. Some of Paul's letters are authentic, except for a small fraction of fluff in them, but most of them are authentic.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
And then like
Acts is entirely
the
fiction.
Acts of the Apostles and stuff.
Yeah. Acts is just all fiction.
Acts is just all fiction. Okay. All right, great. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's interesting because if you're trying to act as a Christian, which I have in the past, I've done so, it's kind of confusing walking through a minefield of what could be true or false and all that kind of stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff, but the thing about the fluff is it may not be what Jesus said and did, but that doesn't mean it's not interesting or important, because there's very little that we can be sure about Jesus himself, because so many people have been in there tampering with the record. But the records that we do have often tell us more about what the Christian communities that followed Jesus were concerned about. And that's interesting to study. Who were these different groups? What did Jesus mean to them? how did they want to change the message going forward? You can learn a lot about those things by looking at the Gospels and by looking at Acts. The Acts, it's not that it's not something that people should read. It's something that people should read in the same way that you read the Iliad or the Odyssey. I mean, if you want to know the value system and the concerns of the classical Greeks, you learn an enormous amount by reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's the same with Acts. And it's also important to know that after Acts, people thought it was authentic. So for 2,000 years, people are going to be responding to Acts as though the things that it describes really happened. So it helps us understand where they're coming from.
Hey Rick, I'm sorry. This is my first time at this meeting, so I don't know
Hey,
how
welcome.
the
Welcome.
procedure with interruption or questions. I know there's a large chat, and I've been working from home. I have a snow day here. We got hit with 2 feet of snow, so I've been only listening with half an ear. So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole if you have already talked about this, but if you could maybe direct me in the chat or just some sources. So earlier you said Acts is kind of, a lot of people refer to that as the lineage of the early church, the structure of the bishops, et cetera, the formation of the church structure. Um, now, when you're saying it's fluff or fiction, like, is there? I'm trying to grapple that with, like, what would the premier document be on denominations or Roman Catholicism or whoever when they point to what the current structure of the Church of Jesus Christ would look like. I mean, if Acts does not have merit, where do we turn for that? Or was it never supposed to be kind of a structurally um, body that developed in time?
It's an excellent question. And over the course of the months ahead, we'll answer it a lot more fully than I'm about to, because
Okay.
we're going to walk through all of these core founding documents of Christianity because we have to understand the mindset of people for the next, like the medieval period from roughly 500 to 1500. They all had this stuff on their mind. So we have to know how they saw the world. And that means even if we know that Acts can't be relied on as history, we have to know the pseudo history that's described in Acts, because otherwise we won't understand what Joan of Arc is referring to, what Augustine is referring to, and so on, because that's their frame of reference. If we accept that we have to learn the mythological history and master it, then the second half of your question is really important, which is, well, then what is the actual history of the early church? And here's the critical thing where scholars differ from Acts is that Acts and indeed the selection of the books that make up the canon of the New Testament, neither of those was done to tell the truth about where the church came from. It was done because bishops in the fourth century were concerned that people would not take their authority seriously. And they had good reason to be worried about that. So they chose out of hundreds, as you'll see at the Early Christian Writings website, out of hundreds of books that were available to them, they picked only the ones that reinforce the notion that there is an unbroken chain of apostolic succession that goes from Jesus to his disciples to the apostles, the next generation of apostles and the church fathers, and then to the bishops with no gaps. In other words, when the bishop tells you to do something, you should treat it like Jesus is telling you to do that thing. This is what the bishops were concerned about in the 400s. And so they picked books that would reinforce that. And they picked Acts because Acts was written in a large part to reinforce that, to create that sense that there was never any argument, there was never any fundamental disagreement. But all the evidence that we have outside of the various documents that were created to try to push that view, the evidence that we have is that, on the contrary, there never was a single line of unbroken succession that the medieval church derived from. Because the first evidence that we find from about early Christianity, there already seem to be a dozen completely different sects, many of whom have never heard of each other. And they believe totally different things about Jesus and what his life meant and what you're supposed to do. It doesn't start with a chain that people gradually break away into heresy from. It starts with a whole bunch of competing ideas. And then gradually some of them get woven together and others get suppressed. And that's what Acts is trying to cover up. And the other things is that there was this enormous diversity in early Christianity.
Okay, and so just last question is, to your knowledge, is Acts written by Luke or is it not?
Well, the one thing that most Bible scholars agree on is that Mark didn't write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke, Matthew didn't write Matthew, and John didn't write John. And what they do instead is you can imagine that when the Bible scholars say Luke wrote Acts, that the Luke is in quotation marks, and that what they mean by that is there is a community. One of the many different threads of early Christianity was a community that had the value system that's on display in Luke and in Acts. And they wrote the Gospel of Luke together, and they wrote Acts together. Somebody within them or some group of them together created those things. Um, so that's kind of the notion. With Paul, we know it's Paul. Paul's a legitimate, serious guy writing in the 50s. And once we strip away the stuff that isn't Paul, what we're left with is letters that are in his name, by him, claim to be him, and appear to be biographically correct. But we can't say that about any of the Gospels or Acts.
And the same with Peter. Peter's letters are attributed to Peter.
Yeah, and we're pretty sure Peter wasn't written by Peter. The letters from John aren't written by John. James isn't written by
Okay.
James. They're by
Okay.
communities. And
Yeah.
to say they're not by the guy isn't to say that they're not important and interesting. There's important theology and community building in each of these documents. And what they represent is each of them gives us another one of the many strands that ended up being braided together to create what became the medieval church. That appears to be, and Bert and Mac's line and my line are both on this, that none of this does anything to invalidate Jesus or Christianity. It puts it on a more realistic footing. When Jesus died, we don't know why his followers fragmented into dozens of different groups, but apparently they did. And the word shouldn't be apparently. Evidently, the evidence is that they did. And this may be something that we never understand how and why it happened. And, life's full of mysteries. Or maybe, 60 years from now, somebody digging in the junk pit at Oxyrhynchus will come up with some critical early document that says, here is why early Christianity broke into 36 different sects. And we'll all go, finally, the damn answer we've been looking for. But it's one of the big unanswered questions that early historians have about how we get, and basically it's how do we get from Jesus to Paul, and how do we get from Paul to the Gospels? These are some of the jumps that we would love to be able to account for. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
If you keep coming, we will keep digging in this. I mean, every week we dig a little further and see what we can find.
Yeah, it's today was like I said, a snow day from work, so that's why I'm here. But I'll try
It
to
worked out for you.
see
Well,
where I can participate where I can. So thank you.
sure. And the sessions all end up on YouTube under David Roel's account on YouTube. So you can follow them there, and if you comment on them, we'll respond as best we can.
All right, sounds great.
Available for you, sir. All right. I see Joe just joined. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the call. There's the link. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, everybody. I wanted to point out something, at least interesting to me, as usual, as I like to notice that when these early Christian guys do their things, it reminds me of like the Jewish playbook on their way to sort of rhetorically enhance authority or claim authority. And you've referenced this before. It was a work called Pirkei Avot. You pronounced it differently. But it means ethics of our fathers, but really it's more like soprasune language, because it really is often we don't reference it as ethics, we call it the wisdom of our fathers. But essentially it's all wisdom language, like I think it was Matthew, right? Was that the wisdom document? It was just all wisdom. So this is also, but the one thing that's spoken essentially outside of the book in a dialogue, an oral transmission, apparently, and apparently this has been going on for forever, as they claim, and that's part of the interesting rhetoric, is that this is the document that points to the unbroken transmission between like Mount Sinai and now, right? And so if you want to prove, and the thing is, it's so interesting because at least me, from a very intellectual perspective, I think that I make the obvious claim that is an incredibly unprovable statement. You cannot tell me that is a faith-based statement. That is not an evidence-based statement. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that, fine. But clearly, if you want to make the claim through evidence, it's a really tricky thing that you're saying that there's evidence, but you have to use faith to it's like, no, but it's a really interesting idea that you have to believe, and it gives you a lot of legitimacy. And it seems to me that that's the motivation. I'm not going to claim what the motivation actually is, but I want to claim the mimicry that I think they're saying we want to look valid when the Hebrews were taken to Babylon, very much like Stephen was saying, and things got different and things got confusing and things got changed, and they wanted to claim some sort of legitimacy and authority thing. They went to this. They created this type of wisdom document to say, hey, the rabbis are actually in charge because we have the secrets from the good place and nobody else does, right? So listen to us, guys, right? And so they're like, oh, that guy's got the secrets from the good place. I want that, right? So at least that's the way I kind of see it. And I think they're just pulling that playbook because it was what the people are used to. It makes sense. It's also validating. Like, look, we want to claim we are the new version of the Hebrews or whatever that thing is. We're some extension of them. We're at least like them. So we're going to use their playbook. And every time we use their playbook, it makes us look stronger and more valid. So I think it really has resonance that makes sense to me. Maybe I'm being a little overly confirming without data and evidence. But to me, this is where I'm hypothesizing that this is a good reason why they would do this, and it validates that it looks like this. So again, okay, that's all.
No, that's great. And it's a common problem that movements have. I'll give you another example from my own life is traditional Okinawan martial arts, karate and kobudo. Who was your teacher? Who was your teacher's teacher? Who was your teacher's teacher's teacher? I mean, they all care about this stuff a great deal. And part of the reason they care about it is that no two groups practice these arts exactly the same way, which raises the question, if you and I practice it differently, is that two legitimate alternatives? Or is one of us right and one of us wrong? Or is one of us authentic and the other one has deviated from it? Or is one of us preserving an earlier state of the teaching and the teaching has grown and developed since then, and the other person has a more advanced or developed or practical, implementation of the same thing? These are the questions people wonder about when they're comparing each other's styles, trying to figure this out. So there is an enormous amount of energy in karate and kobudo goes into this whole question of schools and transmissions, and can you show an unbroken line of succession back to so and so who everybody acknowledges as a great practitioner of kobudo? It's like, can you prove that he taught this guy who taught that guy who taught my teacher who taught me? Do you have that lineage? It is exactly the concern that Ari was just talking about, and it's exactly what the bishops were concerned about in the fourth century, which we'll get to some months from now. But that question of how do you even know if what you're teaching is authentic? How do you know that you have the authority? You think about the time frame of the fourth century that's going to come later. That's when they're trying to convert the Roman Empire. They want to convince Augustine, they want to convince the emperors that Christianity is an excellent choice to run their empire with. And the empire is brutal. They're the punch you in the face empire. And so how do you get brutes to decide to adopt the clever, parabolic, paradoxical wisdom of Jesus? How do you make that sale, if you will? How do you convince them? And you can't just say, well, look at these amazing things Jesus said, because it's gonna go right over their heads. I don't see how this helps me stick a sword in the guy I don't like. Show me how that's gonna work. And so they end up resorting to, okay, well, we make good citizens. If Christians make good citizens, and we all agree, don't we? We all agree on the fundamentals. We aren't squabbling with each other, are we? Of course, they are squabbling with each other, but they're trying to hide that from the Roman Empire and make it seem like they have a united front. And this would be a good idea for them to adopt. And so, considering that their survival is at stake, they're highly motivated in the same way that a karate teacher, a kobudo teacher really has to convince prospective students to join their school and pay the tuition, or else the sensei can't pay his bills and he has to shut his dojo down, which happens a lot of the time. When you have real pressures on you, you come up with solutions, even if they're not always the best solutions. And so in karate and kobudo, not only do you get the real lineages, like here's my teacher and here's who he studied from, you get what they call legend stories. And he got it from this great kata master from the 1600s who lived in a cave on the beach, and you know because he survived a shipwreck and he was practicing Chinese martial arts, and this delegation of people from the town of such and such saw him doing it and said, we will trade you, you know, food if you will teach us your amazing kung fu, and he did, and so this kata has been unchanged, you know, for 426 years. It's the same kata. It's like, well, that's all bullshit, right? None of that's true. Most katas didn't exist before the 19th century. Most of them didn't exist before the 20th century. But these stories are everywhere because they serve a function, which is they get people to say, "Ooh, I want to learn the mystical 426-year-old tradition. That sounds amazing," as opposed to, "I made this kata yesterday because it's a good practical kata for learning how to do these moves." A lot of people are like, well, that doesn't sound nearly as exciting. I want to be a Jedi Knight. Why do I just want to be effective? So this is the kind of stuff that causes people to change to rewrite their own history in order to try to create these easy to understand links that go all the way back. And what we see in Paul is he doesn't care at all about those things. I mean, we're going to talk about this a lot in the weeks to come. But Paul has absolutely no concern for unbroken lines of succession. He even flat out says, I never met Jesus. He says, I didn't take any of my teachings from anybody who did meet Jesus. Why would that be important? And he just pretty much flat out says, as far as I'm concerned, there's no advantage to having met Jesus. The important thing is to teach the teachings. And I can do that. And that's the important part. He said, there are people who've met Jesus who don't teach the teachings. They teach some modified form. So what good did it do them to meet him if, you know, they come away from it teaching something that isn't the lesson? So anyway, that's a little of the backdrop for this. So Burton Mack in his book, Who Wrote the New Testament, he's talking about this issue that for Joe's benefit, just a quick summary. One of the things that I got wrong in the past, which is that I corrected earlier on this call, is I've been talking about Paul as saying that anytime he wants to know what Jesus thinks about something, he can just commune with Jesus directly and have visions, and the vision Jesus will tell him, you know, this is what I think, and then Paul says, great, I'll go tell my people. I picked that up from the church at large. Lots of people think that about Paul, but Burton Mack says Paul doesn't actually say that. That's based on a poor English translation of a passage that everyone translates as it's in Galatians 1:15-16. They translate it in the New Revised Standard Version as saying, God was pleased to reveal his son to me, which makes it sound like a revelation in the sense that I got a vision. He says, but Burton Mack says no serious scholar accepts the translation as to. The use of the word to there, it's because people want Paul to have got it in visions, and so they change it so that it is a vision because it was, you know, revealed to him. It says, but the Greek word is en, and en could be translated as in or by means of, but it cannot be translated to. Nobody ever that word never meant to. And it means that the original Greek book is saying God was pleased to make his son known by means of me. The revelation is, I have a calling. I have a calling. I should be the one to go forth and tell people about Jesus. That's what it's saying. But for thousands of years, we've read that as, oh, he was struck, you know, by a vision. And so, you know, we talked about this, and we talked about how you just can't take Acts seriously as history because Acts contradicts Paul all over the place. And, you know, given the choice between Paul's own description and some guy 80 years later claiming to give you the truth, well, of course, you should never trust the Luke community and what they wrote in Acts. You should trust Paul to tell you his own experience. Yeah, and if given how often Acts does that, it just wholesale invents things in direct contradiction to what Paul said. Given that, for example, I'll give you another one. We'll see it when we get to Acts. But Acts has Paul running around doing miracles. Paul, you know, one of the things that there's a big schism between Paul and the Pauline movement and the Peter movement after Paul's death, and the Luke community that wrote Acts is very concerned with trying to heal the rift and get these two communities to work together. And the way they do that is every single miracle that Peter works, Paul works the same miracle. Every single miracle that Paul works, Peter works the same miracle. They all do the same things in parallel, in lockstep. And the point is to say, see, we don't have to fight. We're one big happy community, and we never really argued. Go ahead, Joe. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'll just say really quickly too. Plus, this tend to be anytime you're looking at it from going like to supernatural. That's another aspect, and then that's the other part too about Acts as well. Everything does move to more of a supernatural translation.
Yes.
Even the idea to me, it's still that there's a supernatural part to that. So that is actually something that, yeah, that I do know some people that have questioned that. I mean, specifically in the past as well. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So it makes it a challenge for us reading Paul. And
Yeah.
it's you know, Paul is, as we're going to see in the weeks ahead, Paul is frequently having debates with different communities to try to persuade them to his
Yes.
approach to Christianity. And he uses every rhetorical trick in the book. I mean, he's educated. He knows how to debate and discuss. And he's trying very hard to persuade these people. If he was working miracles, you think he wouldn't say that in his
Right.
letter? I mean, like last week when I raised that guy from the dead, that's how you know. And he never says he did anything like that. But in
That's right.
Acts, doing it left, right, and center, it's like, woo, he's like another Jesus.
It was almost
And
like a real dialogue with the Greeks and people like that. I mean, it's like and along the way too. I mean, so in his journeys, they were mostly a dialectic in a way, but they weren't necessarily look at
yeah,
the miracles here. Yeah. So yeah, no,
yeah.
very well, very well put.
So this is the thing that leads, and this kind of analysis of the New Testament's been going on since the 19th century. The Germans invented it, and they got serious about textual analysis. And it was a side effect of the fact that they were already doing textual analysis on Aristotle and Plato and Heraclitus and all these works. Euripides, they're trying to say, I have 16 different manuscript versions of the Oresteia, and they don't all agree with each other. So how am I supposed to figure out which one's original and which one's been tampered with? And so they developed this whole skill set in the 19th century. And once they had this is what Nietzsche used to do for a living, which is what made him a philosopher. It's like once you have that ability to really learn to see the style and character and value system of an author so that you can look at a version that betrays that and go, I don't think this is him. This looks more like somebody writing in the Renaissance, pretending to be him. Look at this thing that's a Renaissance concern that the Greeks never cared about. Here's another thing that was a Renaissance concern. The Greeks didn't care about that either. It's this ability to separate character and say, okay, this isn't Spock. This is Captain Kirk pretending to be Spock. This is what the 19th century Germans were doing. And once they developed that skill set, of course, they're going to turn their attention to why do we have four gospels that don't agree with each other? I mean, it's the obvious question to ask about the New Testament, which is how come Mark and Matthew and Luke and John describe things so differently? And it was as a result, these days we talk about the ones without John as being the synoptic gospels, synoptic, we see together. They seem to be looking at the same events. Everybody could see going way back that John is like on planet John. His description of
Exactly.
events is so different.
It's so much it's so much more. That too is mystical,
Yeah.
and you can actually see that it is the logos that it's working off of very much more in a very succinct way. So yeah, no, that's excellent as well. It's so true. That's
Yeah.
something even in Sunday school growing up, it was kind of like, well, where are we going with this one? It's because
Yes.
yeah, so
I am the light and the truth and the way, and
exactly.
there's a lot of that in John that just isn't in the other three.
Exactly. The light, the whole idea of the light is stepping into the light out of the darkness. Like what that actually means, if you really understand it, then absolutely. So it's no,
Yeah.
I completely understand. Yeah, that's great.
So it's funny, and that's where we get the term synoptic gospels. They say, okay, John is obviously on his own planet. The other three are more like each other. But then they started making tables in the 19th century, comparing event after event, saying after saying, parable after parable between the three synoptic gospels, and saying, well, why do they differ? And why are they sometimes like the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the Plain? And is this two different views of the same sermon, or were this two different sermons? And they're trying to tease these questions apart. And this is what starts the whole area of biblical scholarship is looking at this stuff. And it's coming out of that people began to notice finally that you can't reconcile Acts with Paul. It just Paul's letters and Acts are just the Paul that's in Acts is a mythological Paul. He's like if there ever was a King Theseus in Athens, we can be pretty sure he didn't do most of the things that the legendary Theseus did. And this is the current scholarship position on the Paul who appears in Acts, is he's a mythological version of the real Paul, and the real Paul is to be found in the letters. But it was in the 19th century they also made the observation, the reason we don't notice this disagreement between Acts and Paul is because when they canonized this thing in the fourth century, they stuck all the letters after the Gospels. And wasn't that clever? Because first you learned the worldview of the Gospels, which is written in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. And then, armed with that worldview, you try to read Paul, and it becomes a Rorschach test in which you're projecting everything you learned from the Gospels onto these letters, including things Paul, not only that Paul didn't say, but that Paul never would have said, because there's significant differences in theology between Paul's theology and the Gospel theologies. So this is all really interesting. And for Scott's question, how does the testimony of the resurrection fit into this, or the bread of life discourse? This is exactly what we're going to be spending the next several months talking about. Is we're going to go through each one of Paul's authentic 7 letters. Not today. Today we're just introducing the subject, doing an overview. But we're going to go through each one of them and see what Paul has to say. And having spent the last month going through the 7 pre-Pauline fragments that Paul preserved, we could already see how the story of the resurrection, it's a deep question, right? We could see how the story of the resurrection changed over time from the earliest Jesus movement to the movement the way that it was when Paul encounters it right before he begins his ministry. It's the sense of who Jesus was, and what did he say, and what did he do, and what was the significance of his life. It's changing right before our eyes, week by week, as we go from this earlier material to this later material. And of course, it's going to change more once we get more of the side-by-side threads going. When the apocalyptic stuff we're going to really start talking about next week is running as another thread alongside the Jesus was just a teacher movement. So these different groups, they don't agree about everything. And the kinds of question that you're asking, these things get really hard to resolve. And they get easier to resolve in terms of, we can get to where we can say, what did certain groups think about that question at certain times? Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, just to that question too, that even shifts during Thomas Aquinas, very much so, with Aristotle specifically, that whole bread of life discourse specifically, with transubstantiation and things along those lines. So that is very, very much, that is a very deep question that actually ends up being, kind of revisited over the years.
That's right. That's right. So it's interesting, because as we saw in Q and in the early layers of Thomas, the early sayings Christians, the ones who just walked around keeping collections of Jesus's sayings, they didn't say anything about his death, let alone a resurrection or redemption. None of that. It's all just missing. It's entirely absent. They don't even say anything about his life. Like, the only thing that they care about is, look at these amazingly wise things that this guy said. We're going to write all these wise things down, and we're going to read them to each other, and we're going to think about how to apply them in our own lives. It's like if you read Aristotle or Plato, or you read about Socrates or Heraclitus, and your goal isn't, I want to be saved from hell. It's like, look at this wise stuff. I want to be wise like that. The parts of the early Jesus movement that are captured in Q and Thomas are clearly of that flavor. They don't know anything about Jesus's death, which is astonishing to us, because so much of the later focus becomes about his death. And we'll see the same thing when we get into the apocalyptic strand and the prophecy strands, where the focus isn't at all on what happened in Jesus's life. It's about the future and what is to come. And that's where all the discussion and focus is. These groups, they have wildly different concepts of Jesus. All right, so we were talking about this idea that maybe the notion of Paul as somebody who's periodically rocked by visions, either whether they're voluntary or involuntary, in order to get his answers, which I've always thought, this may not be the evidence that Paul is giving us. This may be a consequence of the way that Paul's been translated or mistranslated, especially in the context of us having absorbed the mythological Paul from Acts of the Apostles and be trying to read that into the epistles. Paul himself, in his own words, we'll find out over the next 7 weeks as we go through each epistle. But it may turn out that Paul didn't think he had visions, and that's just been bad translation from the Greek all this time. So then one more bit before I go back to it. Again, this is just confession is good for the soul, right? The whole purpose of existentialist philosophy is that we're not supposed to have a program or a system. We're supposed to be exploring the world as best we can, and with the understanding that we're wrong about a lot of things, and that a lot of the things that we think are true, we should understand we only have a partial grasp on the reality. The reality is the reality, not our teachings, not our ideas, not our systems, etc. And that means we always got to be on the hunt for what's another piece of bullshit that we can identify in our own belief system and jettison. So maybe Paul didn't have visions. I don't know. We'll see as we read Paul. There may not be evidence for what I've been saying for the last 2 years. And that's good, right? We gotta find that bull, and we gotta kick that bull out of our brains. Make room for the good stuff. See what Paul's actually talking about. All right, so we've got that. What else do we want to talk about to introduce Paul? Paul tells us a little bit about himself, and this is in Galatians 1:30. Oh, sorry, from Philippians. He says he was circumcised on the 8th day. He was a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. That's Philippians 3:5-6. And it is interesting because when we put that into the context of the other things that he tells us about himself, it raises certain questions, like, so clearly he's a Jew and specifically a Pharisee. We're not talking about somebody who is a Greek. And therefore, this underscores something that Bert and Max said in the other book that we were going through with him 2 months ago, which is that an enormous number of Jews at the time of Paul were Hellenized Jews. They had a Hellenized education. They're part of they're living in areas that had been under the rule of Alexander or the Ptolemies or the Seleucids, and under Roman control now for some time. And Hellenic education and systems of thought were so widespread that you had vast numbers of Jews who didn't speak Hebrew. Right? I mean, we like to imagine that Jews at all times were like Jews today, and they all went through all of the stages, all of the rituals. They all learned to speak Hebrew. They all read their passages from the Torah for their bar mitzvah. All of these things happen, but Ari makes a point repeatedly that Judaism changes over time. It goes through different historical periods, and the Jews themselves know that, and they study that about themselves. And so we shouldn't be surprised to discover there's this period of a few centuries here where lots of Jews spoke Greek and were educated in the Greek system of learning. So we have a guy who's obsessive about the law and following it, but who's a Greek speaker. And the question becomes kind of, what was he, what is this righteousness he's talking about? What are these purity codes? And if he was a persecutor of the church, by which we mean the Christian church, what does he mean by persecution? If we have to exclude Acts as evidence and just look at Paul's own letters, what does Paul tell us about this? It's interesting. It comes out differently. One of the things that Burton Mack talks about is there is this issue that we've talked about, that you have the enormous number of people in Galilee who are dissatisfied with living the Roman style life. They're looking for alternatives. Some of them are finding it in Judaism. They're forming symposia, or Jewish interest groups, where they want to learn Jewish law, they want to study Jewish law, they want to live like the Jews live and have a community like the Jews have, because the Jews are able to hold themselves together in a community far more effectively than all these other scattered people from all over the Roman Empire, who are just flotsam and jetsam, disconnected, ungrounded from their traditions, who are lost and looking for a new way to live. And these clubs are forming, and in these clubs there are all of these Gentiles going, how do I become a Jew? And this presents a real problem for the Jews. What are you supposed to do with all these people? I mean, they don't have Jewish mothers, right? I mean, they're Greeks, they're Romans, they're Persians, they're absolutely not Jews ethnically. And so the evidence seems to be that what Paul was doing was running around these specific communities, not all Gentiles everywhere. He was running around these specific communities, these Judeophiles, I guess you could call them, Judeophile symposia, where you've got all these communities, Jesus communities that have formed, and they're studying the works of Jesus, and they're studying Judaism, and they're trying to figure out how to be good Jews, even though they're not Jews at all. And he's proposing a solution to them. And the solution should be familiar to those of us who studied the conflicts captured in Acts and other places in the Bible. The solution is, okay, I can't make you retroactively have a Jewish mother. And I can't make you retroactively be of the Jewish ethnicity. But if you will follow all of the law, we will let you in. Right? We'll let you be part of our communities. But you got to get circumcised. And this is a test. Right? I mean, if you're not willing to be circumcised, you must not really be serious. I know it's going to hurt. Believe me, I know it's going to hurt. I was circumcised, but you have to do it. And if you're not willing to do it, then you're not serious, and we don't want you in our community anyway. We're not a proselytizing religion. We're not an evangelical religion. It was never our goal to convert the world to Judaism. But since you're here banging on our doors saying, let us in, let us in, let us in, and God knows we need some peace, we're going to give you a path to get in. And the path is going to be you follow all of the law. And that's Paul before his conversion to Christianity. That's his solution that he's offering people. And, you know, this is partly a response to the idea that you know, he's got an interpretation of Judaism, and it'll be interesting to see what Ari thinks about this, that the destiny of Israel wasn't only to be its own little nation in its own little corner of the world, but instead to live a righteous life and become a light to the nations, a beacon to the nations, as one of the prophets put it. And so you're supposed to, I mean, Judaism is supposed to at least look attractive and be authentically virtuous. Those things are true. And if that's true, then you can't complain about the fact that all these Gentiles, in fact, are seeing the beacon and they are approaching and they do find it attractive and they do want to live a righteous life. And so you have to give them a way in. And so this is why he's doing what he's doing is you know, and go ahead. Yeah, Ari, this is perfect time. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, and this is in the name of Rabbi Sachs, so I'm a big Rabbi Sachs guy, but it's always good to have a good name. And he's not everybody, but I think he reflects a pretty mainstream approach, which is exactly like you're saying. But there's another idea that he explores in his book called The Great Partnership, the difference between science and religion, for anybody who wants that. It's actually pretty simple. Science provides a model of the world, or in general, before meta science, meta religion, not specifically, just in a much more thin idea, that scientific type of thinking, probably we would call them the Verstand or the whatever that stuff is. This is how the model of the world should be, like as a model. And then the religious type of thinking is how to be in the world, a model of being in the world. So how one should actually be in that model. So it's like, for instance, this is how Monopoly works, but then this is how I would play the game, right? So these are two different things. And so he basically makes this claim in that book, The Great Partnership. Why was this important? Because he's saying that in that book, he goes through the history of what he believes that the rise of ancient Israel and the rise of ancient Greece, similar, seems to have a lot of these things. Just like you were saying about the Heraclitus and the Taoist stuff, he makes the same claims. It's like it's really suspicious and weird that both these two groups around the same time, within like 50 to 100 years, seem to have the exact same type of wisdom language and other things going on. There's definitely some cross-pollination. But he says the claim was seemingly both of these nations have this sort of we're the chosen people idea. And their idea was we're a light unto the nations. And the simple idea is we're grown-ups. We want to show how children should turn into grown-ups. And not to really, the idea originally wasn't supposed to be like you're all children and we're adults. That's like the bad version, like we're superior. The version was like we were children too, and we learned how to grow up. And we are offering this wisdom for how you go from essentially an incomplete species that doesn't know what it's doing, and you needed to be completed with something. So here's our culture that's going to go complete you. And he even claims that Greece seemed to represent the sort of the more scientific approach, and Israel represented more of the religious approach. But he claims that more like that's not really what's going on. That's more like the Greeks seem to have more of a universal approach, and the Jews had a more of a particular approach. But again, there was this dialectic between the universal and the particular that was going on. And it was very complex, and we don't have access to all of it. But he claims they were kind of like brothers in this sense, and that there was something going on, that there was a similar idea, that it was mostly about this idea of going from an I to a we. This is why you couldn't be a barbarian was not a part of polis, because they're an I, essentially. You can't be a citizen unless you're a we. So being a human and adult means being a we, and being an animal means being an I. And this is very similar in both of these cultures, it would seem. I might be overly reducing it, as what's it called? Stephen likes to keep me straight, that I get too reductive. But this is the idea that I think this is a through line through which a lot of other complexity sort of mitigates through. So there's a lot of complexity, but I think this is nice. And I definitely like this approach of saying this is essentially, if you want to really boil it down to a much more simple, naive, like not so horrible statement, just like we thought we grew up. We'd like other people to grow up too. This is how we think it works. Okay, that's all.
I like it. Thank you, Ari. And this goes to, the Bert Mack's point in this book, which is that, Galilee is this melting pot between the Greeks and the Jews and their side, and a lot of third parties from all over the Roman Empire. And they're all just living side by side and having to try to figure out how to be neighbors and form these little kind of cosmopolitan communities. And, his argument is that when Paul says he persecuted the church, that what he specifically, it's not that he persecuted Christianity in general. It's these early Jesus movements where people have decided that Jesus's own righteous life was enough to make them blameless, and to make it so that they could join the Jewish community without following Torah law. Because this is the existing Jesus movement that Paul is persecuting, that he's objecting to. And the reason he's objecting to it is that he has a different solution for these people. He says, you do have to follow Torah law. If you follow Torah law, then you can join the community. But you can't say you've already joined, and you certainly can't, because, hello, circumcision is the least of the things you haven't done. But not only that, it's there's one right way in, and I'm telling you what the right way is to get in, and you're not doing it. You're insisting that you're blameless and sinless and part of the community when I know you're not. This is what the fight was. Two different ways to resolve the question for the symposia, for the fan clubs, the Judeophile fan clubs. And that this is a very different position than what Acts give us. What Acts give us is he's preaching to the Gentiles in general. In general, he's converting the Gentiles. But Bert Mack says that's not what any of the mainstream Bible scholars think. They say the evidence is that these symposia already existed, and he was objecting to the way that they were trying to solve the problem. He had a different solution for them. But as he puts it in his introduction here to the section on Paul, he says, somehow he got from, as he put it in Galatians 1:13, from violently persecuting the Church of Christ, and trying to put an end to it. Somehow he comes around to the position of instead, and in his own words, he says he entirely adopts its core principles and becomes its strongest advocate. And what could possibly make that happen? And Acts has its mythological version, but Bert Mack is asking us, well, what evidence does Paul give us for what it was? And he says, well, it's that his mind was changed. He says he only had to figure out two things, one of which, granted, would be really painful for a Jew like Paul, but it's still possible. And the other would have been really attractive to a Jew like Paul once he had agreed to the first thing. And so the first thought is, what if the Christians are right? What if Gentiles don't need to be circumcised in order to belong to the people of God? And that would, of course, been the hardest thought to have for Paul. I mean, it's deeply revolutionary, and it involves violating Torah law, which Paul has been, authentic to all his life. But once you start seriously asking that question, another question comes up long before you even answer it. Another possibility comes up, which is, if they were right, if the Gentiles didn't need to be circumcised, we're not saying that they are right, but what if they were right? Something amazing becomes possible, because it means that it opens the door to a concerted mission for Judaism to become a proselytizing evangelical religion, in which the light to the world stops just being a light and starts being a light that can actually reach out to the world and bring people into this modified Jewish faith. You could actually do something about this. And the thought that would occur to Paul is, the right place, quote unquote, for all Jews to live is Israel. But as we know, because of the diaspora and other things, there are Jews, synagogues all over the place outside of Israel. And how is this part of God's plan? Right? Because God has a plan. This is one of the most fundamental things about the Jewish God. He's got plans. And so it cannot be an accident that all these Jews have been scattered all over the place. What if the reason they've been scattered is to become a seedbed for converting the Gentiles? Rather than being lost from Israel, what if they're reaching out from Israel so that the message of God can reach all of these other people and they could become righteous people? And Burton Mack's line, which he says is sort of the standard line, is that the first idea by itself was just too much. It was just intolerable. Of course, you have to follow Torah law. But once you consider the possibility that these people could be right and not follow Torah law, all the rest of it suddenly is explosively illuminating and exciting. Judaism as an evangelical religion to convert the entire world to righteousness. God acts, the Jews not suffering needlessly. They're being scattered for a reason. They're being scattered to become this net that draws in the world. It all starts to make sense out of everything that's been happening in the Jewish world around his time. And it's going to help even more than he knows, because after he dies, you're going to have the terrible thing that the Romans do to Israel and to the Jewish temple. The Jews are going to be scattered even more widely, which would feed even more into the idea that scattering was on purpose, that was God's plan to take the righteous people, scatter them across the world, and use them as the way to draw in the whole world. And so putting all these pieces together, and he decides to switch to the side of these Judeophile symposia and say, okay, yeah, Jesus, by living the most faithful, righteous life that any Jew could live and dying for that faithfulness, he has indeed opened the door to all these other people to enter the blessed community and become part of the kingdom of God. And that it's not struck with a vision on the road to Damascus and changing his name from Saul to Paul. It's thinking it through. And he says part of the reason why this is the typical position that biblical scholars adopt is that, contrary to the version that is in Acts, the evidence from Paul's own letters is that after he started thinking this, he didn't just suddenly start running around the world converting people. Years went by. He chewed and chewed and chewed on these ideas. He thought about them for a very long time. And then he did a few visits, including the visit to Jerusalem, to go visit the pillars, James, Peter, and John. And as he says, the polite way to put it is that didn't go very well. It says Paul tries to make the best of it in his letters, but when you look at the conclusions that come out of it, the conclusion is that Peter is just going to continue preaching to all of the converted, all the Jews, and Paul can have all those Gentiles that Peter doesn't care about, that Peter's not interested in, and as for the second part, should Jews share table fellowship with Gentiles? It looks like Peter, James, and John are sort of like, whatever. Go do your own. Leave us alone and go do your own thing. Is apparently how that meeting went. And after that, that's when he really starts doing his movement in detail, and he really starts pushing and he starts writing his letters. Pretty shortly after that. So they're guessing that the visit to Jerusalem it's guessed to be around 48. And the first letters we have, like Thessalonians, start around 50. So he gets to work. And again, if in Acts, the mythological Paul invents churches wholesale all over the place. He sets up churches from nothing. But the Paul version, which fits with what Burton Mack is describing, is that what he actually did is he went and found existing symposia next to diaspora synagogues that already were full of Jesus movement people. And he began preaching to them this modified version of what they already believed. And so he's not really preaching to Gentiles in the Acts sense of the word, in the modern sense of the word, wholly unconverted people. He's preaching to Judeophile clubs all over Galilee and Samaria and Idumea and even Judea and beyond Syria. And so that's interesting. That's interesting. That rather than a blank slate and the heroic Paul goes forth and wrenches Christianity up out of the bare soil through the might of his thews, he's taking a movement that was already most of the way there and adding a little bit, adding a new take. Donna, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, just something real quick. So that vision that Paul had with the table coming down, and he was supposed to not be too orthodox and expand the whole thing to the Gentiles, is that possibly not a true vision? Like just a story?
Is that in Acts or is that in his letters?
No, it's not in, I don't remember where that was. Oh, sorry, I don't remember where that was. But yeah, he had this vision of that God was telling him to spread his action, basically. Don't keep things orthodox. Don't just eat the Orthodox way. Spread out to the Gentiles.
Yes. Well, let's see. I'm just doing a quick Google search. In which New Testament does Paul have his vision of the table?
Banquet table, whatever.
Oh, 2 Corinthians. Look at that. 2 Corinthians. So we're gonna do 2 Corinthians in the weeks ahead, and when we do that, we can take a close look at what they have to say about that.
Yeah, it seems to fit with what you're talking about now. So I just wanted to put that out.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, right on topic.
You're on mute, Rick.
You're muted, Rick.
Oh no, muted. So yes, these things take on a different interpretation when we read these letters, stripped of Acts and stripped of the Gospels, because remember the epistles are the first thing we have in the New Testament. Although they're put later, they actually chronologically come earlier. And by restoring the order and looking at the epistles outside the context of Acts and Gospels, we get closer. Thanks, John. See you next time. We get closer to being able to see what Paul actually means.
Bye, John. Oh, he's already gone.
closer to seeing what Paul actually means. This is a theme that Kenneth Smith and the existentialists talk about a lot. The problem for Homo sapiens is that the more we develop our interpretive framework for understanding the world, the harder it is for us to actually perceive the world. Because standing between us and the reality is this interpretive matrix. And the interpretive matrix is, before we even can think clearly about the thing that we're trying to look at, the interpretive matrix is already making certain things disappear into the background. And it's putting spotlights on certain details of what we're looking at because they stand out as important features in our interpretive matrix. So it calls attention to them and it hides the rest. And the result is when we very first perceive something and begin thinking about it, we're perceiving and thinking about a distorted version of reality. This is the epistemological problem. I mean, all the way back to 550, this is what Heraclitus warns us about. He says, although everybody is in direct contact all the time with the logos, which is, how nature works, the laws of nature, the deep principles of the world, they're right in our face all the time. He says, but people act as though they have no acquaintance at all, like they've never even met the logos. Like they never once for a second in their lives spent any time in its presence, even though every second of their lives has been spent in its presence. That's how disconnected we get from reality. He says, instead of letting ourselves be guided by the shared intelligence of nature itself, which has this deep meaning and order to it, according to the classical worldviews, he says people instead act as though each of us has our own private intelligence that's binding on reality. If I'm an abstract ideologue and I think that everything is math and nothing that isn't math is real, I interact with the world as though that's true, even though it's obviously not true. Nature has multiple layers of meaning, but my reductionist ideology tells me that I must disregard all those layers and somehow reduce them to just being numbers and arithmetic and whatever I think math means to me. He says that thing of relying on our private intelligence instead of treating our private intelligence skeptically as a problem, as an obstacle to understanding. He says that because we lean on it so hard, he says we end up being sleepwalkers. It's like we're not even awake. We're just sleepwalking through life, reacting to the dream that we are misinterpreting reality as being. And what we do and our actions are as dangerous to us and the people around us as when a sleepwalker is walking towards a cliff or about to put their hand on a hot stove. And they don't know it because in their dream, there is no cliff, or they can fly, or there is no hot stove, or they're immune to fire. Whatever's going on in their private intelligence is blocking their ability to perceive what's really happening. And this is what happens to us when we try to read Paul after we've gone to Sunday school and read the Gospels and read Acts. Is we treat it like a Rorschach test, and we project all of our education onto his letters. The authentic Paul is a very interesting and strange dude, and we're gonna get to know him really well in the weeks ahead. And part of the reason that we're spending this time, I said in general I'm going to be introducing us over time to the desert mothers and fathers, the hermits, and their mystical writings. We'll talk about Hildegard von Bingen.
I want to add to it that like I don't think this is a sorry, that wasn't for you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll go ahead. So we'll be adding all of these writers from the later Middle Ages. Augustine will be writing about we'll be doing Aquinas, we'll be doing all these people, but we have to start here. And we began with the fragments before Paul in order to help us understand Paul mostly and to get to Paul. But we're really going to focus on Paul for 7 weeks after this because Paul's the first Christian that we know by name, and we know something about his life and the things that he did, and something about his belief system because he documents all this, which, by the way, is a very Greek thing to do. Is to talk about yourself in a way that other people can understand. Some of the later medieval writers who are not Hellenic at all will give us amazing sermons and visions, but tell us almost nothing about themselves. Famously, Shakespeare tells us so little about himself that lots of people don't think he existed, and they think it was somebody else wrote his plays. But that's the thing, is it became the norm in the medieval era to erase yourself, efface yourself, abase yourself, to not want to be an egotist. But in the classical Greek tradition, you're supposed to be present. You have to really be a person. You have to acknowledge that you have a character. Your character affects how you interpret the world, and it's really not fair to other people if you don't lay yourself out on the table for them to inspect. You know, your arguments and who you are should both be present in the conversation. And we see Paul doing that. It's not just that he speaks Greek, it's not just that he had a Greek education. He actually gives us enough about himself to understand, you know, yeah, there were Christians before Paul and there are Christians after Paul, but this is the first time we actually get he's not just a name. We actually get a person. Um, so this is one of the most important stepping stones on the way to seeing the medieval worldview is here's this guy at an early stage in the development of the theology. All right, so this is it for this week for Paul. And after this, let's turn to Kenneth Smith. Just a reminder for those who joined, you know, we're working our way through Kenneth Smith's Millennia and Microcosm. And in that book, we're going through his chapters that are about the medieval worldview. That's why we're spending this time talking about medieval thinkers, is to reinforce Kenneth's book with direct primary source material for medieval thinkers. So we can make up our own minds, compare and contrast with what Kenneth is saying about the medieval worldview. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that most likely Jesus was using natural amphitheaters to speak to large crowds. You know, if it was a feeding of 5,000, they seem to have gone to some spot that was a bit away from everything. So if they took food there and were able to feed the multitude, which, you know, the rich people who supported him could probably supply the money. That's what they were coming for. I don't know if he used the amphitheaters of the main towns. He seems to have avoided the Greco-Roman amphitheaters, but possibly he went there too. But well, it's like the thing in Iceland. Why did they meet at that spot? Because you can hear what the guy's saying. So I'm sorry.
Yes.
I've overturned Monty Python.
No, you're probably right. Yeah. I mean, Life of Brian, yeah, he's just standing on a box in the middle of a field. But this is the world that was conquered by Alexander the Great and ruled by his, you know, Hellenistic descendants, and now it's ruled by the Romans. Of course, there's amphitheaters everywhere. They're all over the place. You know, and Galilee is just across the border from the Decapolis, which is 10 Hellenistic city-states, each of which has all of the features of a standard Greek city-state. And so I think you're right. It's one of the things nobody talks about, but there would have been amphitheaters all over the damn place. It's just what they did.
Well, this would have been an age when people were well practiced for looking for good spots to speak.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't have electric amplification back in those days.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And, you know, think about you're a kid and you're growing up in a world that's got amphitheaters all over the place. Of course, every little kid at some point when nobody is around is going to sneak up on the stage and go hee and practice declaiming and hearing their voice echoing off of the amphitheater, because we all remember the first time we did that sort of thing, right? It's cool when you're standing in a location that amplifies your voice naturally because of the construction. Every little kid would have spent time doing that, pretending, right? It's like, what if I were talking to a crowd?
No, looking at Google Earth, you look at the terrain of that Palestinian region, it looks like you could probably take your pick of finding spots where your voice would carry.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for that, Stephen. That's an important point. Donna, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, just really quick. One time I heard a concept of feeding the multitude, meaning that, and it was somebody's concept, that some people in the crowd brought food, so then they were encouraged to everybody share their food, and that's how people got fed.
It could easily have been. I mean, you know, one of the points that Kenneth makes in these chapters is that the early Jesus movement is stressing the differences between, you know, the gifts of the material world. You know, Stephen talked about the materialism of this age versus the gifts of the spirit. And that one of the things that's most important is this understanding that, Yeah, if I've only got a pot, say, I was going to do this example. So what do we got here? We got 10 people on this call. What if I have 17 apples? How do we divide them between us? Right? We're hungry. And we're gonna, so everybody gets at least one apple. And then if we're thinking in terms of the gifts of the material world, then we somehow divide up the remaining 7 apples among the 10 people. But gifts of the spirit could recognize that maybe those remaining 7 apples, we chop them up and we plant each seed. And then we end up with, there's a lot of seeds in each apple. Maybe we end up with 49 apple trees. We now have an apple orchard and we can feed a multitude for a century to come because of how we thought in terms of a non-zero sum game. As long as you're obsessed with zero sum, as long as you're obsessed with how do I keep the other guy from getting my part, you have a tendency to just consume everything because everything is oh my God, if I hang on to it, he might snatch it away from me. I have to consume it. But when you're thinking about the gifts of the spirit, if I love Joe, that doesn't mean I can't also love Stephen and Donald, right? And they can love me, and there's more love to go around. The sharing of the love doesn't decrease the love, it increases the love. This is the gifts of the spirit. They multiply instead of subtract or divide. I plant the apple pips, and now there's going to be tens of thousands of apples out of what was 17, right? We only ate 10 of them, and the other 7 became a whole orchard. This is the kind of thinking that Jesus is trying to focus on over and over. So Donna, I'm right there with you. I mean, that's right in the spirit of these kinds of teachings. They're trying to say, I know the world around us is all take, 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 and it sucks. We hate that world. It's not working for us. But how can we transform, our thinking so that we don't waste opportunities to exercise according to the gifts of the spirit that keep on giving. So last few weeks we went through paragraph 3, and I'm just going to post it there again, for reference. And just a reminder that opening, for those who weren't here in the past, that opening sentence in paragraph 3 is not saying what's hard for all Christians. What it's saying is what's hard for modern Christians, no less than for non-Christian moderns. Christian moderns versus non-Christian moderns. This is a discussion about modernity and the difficulty in understanding how artificial our inner lives are compared to anybody who lived in the past, compared to medievals, compared to ancients, compared to indigenous cultures, and so on. It's hard for us to understand how much of what feels right to us it has been cultivated in us to feel that way through propaganda, through education, through brainwashing, through political PR campaigns, all kinds of ways in which our understanding of the world is manufactured. People are mass produced. All of us are mass produced now. And in attempting to become individuals, we have to struggle against this mass cultivation that was done to us before we could ever start thinking clearly about who did we want to be, what choices did we want to make. The corruption of mercantile activity. Spartans weren't alone. The Chinese had very strong feelings about merchants. And you may recall when Japan first encountered the West, they're like, we'll give you this little island you can land on. And this island, none of us will touch because it's nasty. You're nasty. Everything you're doing is awful. You're just filthy and dirty and gross. And even if you were all taking baths all the time, the mercantile activity you're doing is gross. And the Greeks understood that. So Kenneth Smith talks about this. Why did they put up the statues to the charities, within sight of the agora, to try to remind everybody that the purpose of trade isn't winning, it's not beating the other guy. The purpose of trade is friendship, is to make a better world for us all, and that's why we do trade. And they recognize that the mercantile activity had a tendency to lead people into seeing each other not as people, but as resources, as things, the love of things and the use of people. Anyway, so with all that as our background, let's dive into paragraph 4 with our remaining half hour here. So he starts out, this cloud of unknowing, the unexamined life, normalized as an ultimate, beyond whose limits no one may go, is not pure and simple innocent provincialism, or ethnocentrism, such as existed for millennia, before there were telemedia or even dispersion of the printed word. Right? So we're talking about, first of all, for those who haven't been here before, unexamined life. Anytime Kenneth Smith uses a loaded term, you kind of want to mentally throw a highlighter over that. Unexamined life, your brain should be going ding, 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 ding. Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living for a person. Kenneth never coincidentally uses a phrase like that. If you see a phrase from a potent, famous quote that's important to the history of philosophy, it's because Kenneth he's inviting Socrates into the conversation. Right there, in that little parenthetical comment, he's drawing in everything Socrates had to say, not just about the unexamined life, but of course, Socrates wrote that in the context of Delphi. Know thyself. And Socrates' whole struggle to say, how can I possibly be the wisest of the Greeks when I know nothing? Which leads him to the conclusion, oh, it's because I know that I know nothing that the oracle calls me the wisest of the Greeks. The problem must be the people around me don't know anything either, but they think they do. It's their inability to question themselves that makes them foolish. And it is my insistence on questioning myself that gives me whatever tiny modicum of wisdom makes me wiser than the other Greeks. He says, because I know I'm not wise, but it must just be my competition is terrible, and that must be what the issue is. All of that's being captured in that quotative phrase there about the unexamined life. Another thing that's here that's it's a little tangential, but the more time you spend with Kenneth and with the Greeks, you'll see the relationship. Socrates also famously said that in discussing and debating important subjects, we have a duty to do justice to the rights of the question. That's a Socrates quote, and Plato quotes Socrates as saying that. Justice to the rights of the question. That is, the truth is important, and it's complicated and difficult. And like with a court case, trying to figure out, innocent from guilty, what have people done and what have people not done? Similarly, it's not our purpose in life when we come into contact with difficult questions, we shouldn't be trying to give an answer and move on. This isn't like we're in elementary school and whoever puts their hand up first and blurts out some answer gets an A. It says what you want is to really investigate the issues the same way you would in a court case. You really want to think about it and debate it and explore the alternatives and consider whether maybe the thing that I've always believed could be wrong. That's what might be involved in doing justice to the rights of the question. And so this thing about the unexamined life is about, are you doing justice to the rights of the question of who you are and how you behave and what you think is valuable? Because those things should be questioned, and they should be questioned thoroughly. Heraclitus has a quote like this too, where he says, we really shouldn't just make idle speculations about the most important things. That's Socrates is rephrasing that Heraclitus quote when he talks about doing justice to the rights of the question. He says that there are deep things in the world that you have to think deeply about. You may never get a clear answer on them, but you have the duty to search and to keep investigating those things. And knowing what you don't know, knowing how much you don't know, being conscious of it, owning your bullshit, taking responsibility for it as baggage that you have to try to protect other people from, rather than just inflict it upon them in a blind, unknowing way. He says all of that is part of the duty of growing up and being a person. And all of that is being evoked by Kenneth Smith in this phrase. You call on unexamined life, you're calling on the patron saint of philosophy, Socrates. You can't call on Socrates without bringing in a whole host of Socratic issues in tow. This is how Kenneth writes. He's not trying to give you sentences that you can pin down as part of a logical syllogism. It's why at the beginning I say this is not an exercise in logic that we're doing here. You will never be able to establish a set of premises from which you can derive the rest of the system. There's no system. Existence has to precede essence. We acknowledge that we're in a world that's bigger and more complicated than we are. We acknowledge that not just the nature around us, but the nature inside of us, our own character, is bigger and more complicated than we know. And it's our duty to be explorers in the unknown, to be our own little Sherlock Holmeses and scientists and so on. So, but where Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, we're following up on, the end of paragraph 3, where he says, the modern forms of the marketplace and what passes for politics among us and what passes for religion among us, is not something that Joan of Arc would have recognized as Christianity. It's not something Jesus would have recognized as his own teachings. The way that so many modern Christians walk right past people who are suffering, or even push policies that cause suffering. These are not things Jesus would have acknowledged and said, yeah, you guys are being true to my teachings. But so many of us think that they are. We can't tell the difference. And the reason we can't tell the difference is, as he says in paragraph 3, so much of what we think about the world and how we value about the world has been programmed into us in an unthinking, reflexive, artificial, cultured, parochial, closed-minded way. Whether we're Christian or not, atheists have the same problem. They just have it in atheist ways instead of Christian ways. It is about modernity specifically. It is part of the zeitgeist of what it means to be modern, to be so artificial and so programmed, and yet to assume that all that artificial crap that was put in us before we began asking questions is somehow the true, authentic self, and that we're there at our most individual when we're inside our minds. And Kenneth Smith saying that's when we're at our least individual, because our minds are so formatted for us before we get started. We have to learn to question those things. And if we don't question those things, then we're wandering through our lives blind to the reality that our interpretive framework is blocking our access to, and blind to ourselves and who we really are or could be, who we could grow into being if we weren't shackled to the programming that we've been given. This is all of what he's invoking here at the opening of sentence 1 when he talks about he's essentially saying that we think that as moderns we think we have a birthright to see things more objectively and scientifically and accurately than any people ever has in the history of the world. And Kenneth says that exact belief is why it's not true. Any scientist who begins investigating a subject, starting from the position he already knows everything about it because he sees more truly than anyone ever has, can't conduct science. All he can do is inflict his ideology on the subject matter. It's the purpose of science, to shake all that stuff up. But the way we program people, we tell them that they have a right to their opinions. In other words, don't shake things up. Protect your ideologies. Defend, rationalize your beliefs. And somehow this is considered free speech. All of this, he says, his metaphor for this is that where Heraclitus says we're sleepwalkers. Kenneth gives us this potent image everywhere we go. We're like that character Pigpen from the Peanuts, who's so dirty that a cloud of dust is kicked up everywhere he goes, which he's cool with. If you've ever read the Peanuts, Pigpen thinks this is great. He likes his dirt. He says, I'm like an archaeological marvel. There's the dust of ages upon me. People could learn so much from me. And what Kenneth is turning this into, we're each in the modern world a kind of cloud of, we're wandering around emitting a cloud of unknowing that's an obstacle to perceiving the world or perceiving ourselves. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, one thing is just really quickly is this, even when we were talking about the idea of the printed word and things along those lines, and I'm thinking technologically speaking, because obviously the written word is part of technology, right? It is a technology of sorts, and you can go through various forms of that with like even the printing, other parts, and how these mediums have these impacts on us. But I wanted to ask, like, to what degree does modern technology even permit for self-knowing? I mean, is there, because to me, I think that there is this, it's pretty difficult in today's age to even do the deep type of inquiry that, not that there isn't an opportunity to do it, but I do think that there is we're inundated with, who we are, as you said, kind of being defined. and thinking that we have solutions to things that we don't. So to what degree I would say is self-knowing really, or even the ability to refine our judgment in today's world possible? Like, and I know that's a very abstract type of question. To what degree is it possible? Scale 1 to 10? No, I mean, but I mean, is it, this is something that is, I think, it is a very big problem in the modern world. Anyway.
Kenneth would agree with you, right? I mean, there's this interesting phenomenon where, Kenneth gives us this model from classical Greece that we think that our interpretive framework is giving us the truth, but actually it's building a labyrinth around us. And the more we think using it, the bigger the labyrinth grows because we have more conclusions that we like, and we now add them to our collection. They build up the walls, and the deeper it gets, the more we think about it, the more trapped we get, which is the opposite of what moderns are taught. Moderns are taught the more you think, the freer you are.
Right.
So you could think your way out of any problem. We love the stories about the clever guy who doesn't know anything about the subject, but he's got common sense. And so he goes in there with his dreams and his common sense and makes everything right. You just have to will yourself to want things. The market teaches that wanting is the only God we need.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever we want, whatever our dream is, that's what we should pursue. And so that even applies to religion. What's the God that we like? Which flavor of religion do we want? And that's the church we join. We subordinate everything, even the sacred and the natural and the human, to desire. And yet the Greeks thought that that was the worst trap of all.
It is.
So we have this interesting situation where to be, and this is part of what he's getting at in the second half of the sentence. He says, if only we just had pure, simple, innocent provincialism, if we just didn't know anything, we'd be closer to the truth. But the more we know and the smarter we are, the bigger the labyrinth that separates us from the truth that we've constructed out of our own brains. And now it's really hard to get us to give up our core beliefs because we've spent decades defending them. And we have so much invested, we're in the sunk cost fallacy. Now, we really don't want to. I mean, if we'd never thought about it before, like, sure, whatever, I can change my mind. It's not a problem. But if I spent my whole life, pinning my identity on this central thing, which turns out to be a falsehood, it's natural, unfortunately, in that artificial natural paradox kind of way. It's natural to not want to give up the falsehood and instead see if I can't find some way to prove my falsehood true so that I can keep it.
That's a great point. I mean, the idea of proving it too. We have data now, right? So we can prove it. And that's the other, it's like this, no, everything exists in our mind and we're constructing it. So all we're doing is kind of gravitating towards our bias within that framework, right? So that it's actually making us, I mean, truthfully, I like the provinciality part of this statement primarily because that it's, in line with the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And so there is an element of humility that's built into it versus this, oh yeah, you know what? I got the equation and I have the data now and I'm just going to run the numbers and then I'll have the answer of, to everything. And so, I mean, and so that, again, it's something where there's a balance, obviously, obviously empirical evidence is an essential part of understanding the world. But it is almost like we get the internet of data, we get all this data. And actually I was in a meeting that actually Ari attended and during the summer, I think it was, what does data really represent? So it really starts to become this constructivist perspective on the world. Yeah. And okay, you have the constructivist, but what are you constructing and how real is that in relationship to you? And I mean, it's just an interesting question. I think about it. And I think theory of mind actually has a lot to offer in this particular area. Like, how do we discover what is true?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Because we're such a noetic Apollonian left in civilization, so focused on education and systems of thinking, to most of us, logic is indistinguishable from science. You see that in Star Trek. Spock is always calling things logical that have nothing to do with logic. It's empiricism. He's treating them like they're the same thing because that's what we do in the modern world. We think they're the same thing. We think we can logic our way to the truth. And in thinking that, we're so conflating empiricism with logic that we're failing to remember the most important thing about logic, which is to be logically valid is completely orthogonal to being true. Things can be completely absolute, they follow every goddamn rule of logic, and they're still absolutely false because your premises were off.
Right.
They're like, well, all I have to do is get the premises right. Well, all I have to do is know everything in the cosmos so that I know which premises I should start with. Because the whole problem with logic is if you don't have the right collection of premises to begin with, your logic is not going to get you to the truth. It's going to get you to some distortion that's caused by being a mortal human being who only has aspectival access to what are the most important principles. We don't really know. So I mean, I like to summarize this. It's my own words, but it's a Kenneth Smithism basically to say, the problem with logic is that for every, 100 logically valid conclusions, 99 of them are false. Valid, but false. And that's almost impossible for a modern to accept. It's how we get, yeah, as Stephen says, rationalism and logicism, they're different things. So yeah, this is what, a lot of Kenneth's work is about the trap of the mind. And how in this case, although being philosophical or smarter gives you the opportunity to get out of the trap,
Right.
it often makes the trap much worse that you're trying to get out of than if you've just been ignorant. Simple ignorance means you haven't built any defenses.
There's an element of almost being childlike, that you hear that sometimes, right? Where you're discovering the world and that there's an openness that you have. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I mean, and we feel like we actually, again, have more answers than we actually do. One of the interesting, actually, and I'll pass it off to Ari because I know he's waiting, but, one of the thinkers that I know that he has quoted in the past many times, Ian McGilchrist, and, how, our minds work, and essentially this Apollonian approach that tends to dominate Western societies that, and I, again, it's not an either or, but it's this balance, and that's wisdom to a certain degree where you're actually balancing the judgment.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll leave it there, but I appreciate that because I mean, I know that we've talked here in the past, specifically and recently too, about the individual that was the Renaissance man that could actually do a number of different things. They didn't necessarily have the technological advancements, but they had to have a broader range of understanding of the world in order to function, right? The specialization has come along and really kind of had an impact on that. And the idea of what is efficient is really kind of, become something that's dominating. So in any case, I'm going to go back to writing my book with Stephen. So,
Yeah, it's that challenge of, the more we invest in noesis, the smarter society tells us we are. But the more we've pulled away from gnosis, and gnosis was the faculty of the mind that gave us access to reality. We might have access to all this learning and systematic thinking, but we're losing access to reality when we're no longer plugged into what do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? Am I angry? Why am I angry? That all that immediacy of gnosis. That's how all these animals stay plugged into the world and don't lose track of it the way that we do. And so you see in the wiser circles in traditional Okinawan martial arts, they pick this up from Zen Buddhism, this idea that to become a great martial artist, you can't be an egotist. There's a thing in programming called egoless programming, where you have to be willing to say, look, I don't need to defend my code. It's got whatever problems it has. And I just as soon find those problems and get rid of them. My ego's not on the line. And they say in martial arts, that's exactly how you have to learn. They say your goal is to always be going back to the beginner's mind, the child's mind, that's able to get out of the programming and be in direct experience with what's happening, to feel and notice the things that when you're too stuck in your head, you can't feel or notice. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So yeah, I'm gonna try to be highly reductive here, so Stephen should love it. Um, I see all of the themes of this seem to me around um, constraints, bringing constraints to our thinking. This idea of humility, um, and then theological ends. And so I'm thinking here now, of course, towards Alistair McIntyre and his beyond. And now we're taking this idea. I think Go used the word constructivism. I think it might not be too far stretched to say that's also at the same time the same trap in the mind as emotivism, and and that essentially it's a very circular. And this is also for Joe, like Borges, circular ruins, this infinite trap, right? And oh, apparently other people might know Borges and that specific text, but that one is fantastically representing the trap of the mind. And I think without ends, without constraints, that's everything are means, and means just blow up, right? This is logic. Logic is just means, but they need these constraints to really behave properly. Um, and so what I'm hearing here, similarly like Alistair McIntyre is saying about emotivism, I wanted to get to this idea just of just having healthy constraints. And when I think what you're saying, Kenneth, is saying about us as moderns, especially on this idea that we have the best knowledge ever, this is like zero constraint thinking. Maybe that is what zero dimensional thinking is in a certain way. It's like but that leads strangely. It's because if you have, now that's a really interesting paradox. Without any constraints, you can't move at all, right? You are zero dimensional. You can't move. And this is actually what I use the analogy in teaching. What the body needs a healthy structure of bones, these constraints, right? Take out the bones and you're a puddle of goo that can't move. So I think that's where we're all circling around, is this idea that constraints, ends, and there's lots of ways of doing this. I feel like we're both, again, I always forget the guy who created this, but the manifest versus the scientific image, Wilfred Sellers, maybe. But that to me is just there. You want to have constraints in either, and you need your constraints to align, right? And when that happens, things work out better. But if like you're saying with updating, you feel things, these feelings that we see things, these are the constraints that whatever models we have in our head, they're actually making sure they work. And that's really weird. Also, the moderns have stopped looking into like reality to see if their models work. I was just listening again to Alan Watts talk about this in The Overthinker. He talks about specifically that you cannot say what reality is because it's not words. And we're often more excited about reading about an event afterwards, and it's ruined if we don't take pictures, right? So this is idea that where model is way more important than reality. And I think it's just a dialectic. What we're really saying is between the constraints and the crazy shit we put in our head. And it's like, I guess you can have any crazy thing you want in your head, so long as it seems to be constrained pretty well by reality. I think that's maybe fair, right? So I don't know. I'll end there. That was good.
It's good, Ari. Thank you. Yeah, I think, this is the word gets overused, but it also gets underused, and the word is dialectic. Many of these things can't be solved on one side or the other. You have to have both sides working, and you have to have them observing each other and critiquing each other. It's not an accident that evolution developed these two antithetical faculties of the mind in us. And where we go wrong is when we cling to one and eschew the other. Because that means we will only cultivate the errors of that part of the mind, that we cling to, and we'll cultivate those errors relentlessly because that faculty of the mind can't perceive its own mistakes. Only the other faculty can see the mistakes, and so we need them both. It has to be in a dialectic. So certainly that's what it means to get a black belt in traditional Okinawan martial arts. Is that you on the one hand, you're not a beginner anymore. You don't have a white belt. You're supposed to quote to the foolish outside of the dojo, they think now you're a master. But inside the dojo, you know that you are a white belt. It's just the white belt that's dirty from experience. It got black from years of practice. They buy black belts. They don't actually make their white belt messy. But the metaphor is that the black belt is the one who understands there's never going to come a point where you can sit on your laurels and say, now I'm a master. The black belt is the one who accepts, I have learned many, many things. And what that mainly gives me is the ability to acknowledge that I will always be a beginner. I'm always beginning the rest of my life and the rest of my training. And alongside the mind of experience, I have to also preserve the mind of the child so that I can always question that experience. So anyway, this is all certainly the stuff that we're talking about with this cloud of unknowing. The cloud of unknowing, that the modernist, overconfidence, the belief that it's our birthright to be considered the smartest of all people ever. This is the thing that makes us so stupid. It makes us the perfect mark for a con, which Kenneth would say is the whole point. The whole point is to make us vulnerable to that sort of thing. So sentences 2 through 3, right? When paragraph 4, he continues on. This is instead a narrowness by design that has been formally engineered and reinforced, catechized into a theoretical self-righteousness. It combines great and facile sophistication with abysmal naivete, hopeless poverty of insight with turgid egocentrism. Oh, I love that phrase. And obtuse arrogance with self-perceived humility. Right? To be arrogant while simultaneously thinking among the things you're arrogant about is how humble you think you are. Nobody's as humble as I am. I'm so very humble. Says this is the insanity of the modern brand. Is that, first of all, it's modern, which means everybody else is obsolete. So we don't have to study anybody from the past because they're all out of date. Only I'm up to date. Right? And we hold these truths to be self-evident. We're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights, among which is, although it's not on the list, the right to be correct. I win. I'm a modern. My theories are the best theories. Your theories are stupid. And we find ourselves then in these endless flame wars because this kind of ignorant egotism that we are catechized into, it doesn't lend itself to solidarity or negotiating half-truths. What if you've got part of the truth and I've got part of the truth, and there's other parts of the truth neither of us have, but each of us thinks we're absolutely right and the other guy's absolutely wrong. We spend all our time not looking at our own errors, but looking at the other guy and what we can see in him that's wrong and saying, look how wrong you are. And the other guy, meanwhile, sees our errors and goes, no, you're the one that's wrong because of blah, blah, blah. And we can't perceive how each of us has got a piece of the picture because we're so busy trying to have a zero-sum game and win. We're designed this way because it makes us useful, right? Little implements for the great machine. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Now, the reason why I just really quickly want to, because I think that this is worth adding, is the idea, and I think because it's so dangerous and it happens so often in today's world, is the idea of false humility. And, false humility in the sense that what is it really that they're trying to do when you have false humility? It's a manipulation.
Yes.
So it's like the opposite. It's actually something that is really devious in nature because you're trying to say, one, look at me, which is actually the opposite of humility anyway, right? So that look at me, I'm humble. But then on top of that, you're trying to get the person to actually to acquiesce to whatever it is that you want. And so that, that look at me and, I'm the person to you're supposed to follow. And it's like, well, no, I mean, but I do think this happens quite often in a lot of different relationships that, where there are people that, act humble and act in a way, but it's very, very manipulative in nature. And it's away from one of the most important things that we've talked about here is this element of authenticity and knowing thyself. Right? So it's the opposite of that, where there is this behavior, just like this is who I am, and that it's up to you whether or not to accept it. So you're actually imposing on another person's autonomy to a certain degree in that. So it's very interesting that because I mean, even in religious circles that tends to be a sin, that the element of false humility, that if you're demonstrating it, you ought to catch yourself and correct it, because it is essentially you're, again, harming another person, or attempting to anyway. But anyway, it gets to what, this perceived humility, the self-perceived humility is exactly what this is.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And the reason he's talking about these things right after the paragraphs where he's talking about problems for modern Christians is he's trying to talk about, something that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both talked about, which is how difficult it is for a modern to be a Christian. It's not hard to call themselves a Christian or believe themselves a Christian or get an entire community of people who think they're Christian to call you a Christian. But can you actually be a Christian? And can you be a Christian in a way Jesus would have recognized? Or Aquinas? And it's part of where the gap is for us in understanding the medievals, is that we tend to want to Rorschach test all over them our modernist interpretations of Christianity and say that must be who they were. Except as moderns, we have to make them an inferior version of that. So they must be some primitive version of that. And what we can't imagine is that in order to reconcile Christianity with the marketplace and with this kind of artificialization that has happened to us, this kind of false humility, this egocentrism, this belief that we're more advanced than everybody else, that what results from that isn't it can't be Christianity. The only way you can be some modern thing that calls itself Christianity, but the only way to be an authentic Christian in the modern world is to confront modernity. You have to look at directly what modernity has done to us and struggle to roll some of that back. And in that struggle is analogous to the struggle it would take to try to be an authentic Greek philosopher today. As we saw in our first 2 years together, how hard did we work to get a half a dozen classical concepts clear to us? It was hard. It took 2 years. Right? It was an enormous struggle because every word or idea we would have used to try to understand the Greeks has been redefined in modern terms that exclude the Greek philosophy. It make it impossible to hold. And the same thing happens with the medieval perspective. It's why I'm belaboring it and taking the time on it that I am. I'm giving us 3 years instead of 2 years on this, because it's even harder for us to do this because of the way we've like a worse than a palimpsest, we've wallpapered over the Middle Ages to make them the thing that we think that we need from them. So this, of course, leads into the final sentences of paragraph 4. No astute inhabitant of Christendom, modern Christendom, can have failed to observe the kind of aggressive stupefaction by which churchly know-nothingism propagates itself, like what we see in politics when politicians pretend to be Christians. Oh my God, it's just on display there. Or televangelism, we see it. The motto of all censors: we read in order that others may not. Oh, what a talk about false humility. We read in order that others do not. Draws a boundary around all of Christendom and encloses within it any islands of free thinking. There is much, infinitely much, that counts as forbidden knowledge for modern Christians. And part of this has to do with trying not to look at the seams and the compromises that we've made to try to have the brand of Christianity while betraying its spirit and adhering to the dead letter in a way that's consistent with the modern marketplace and modernism in general. These are real struggles. These are very difficult issues. And it isn't the first time, as Scott points out in the chat, some of this stuff goes all the way back to early Christianity, these authenticity versus artificiality. These are struggles we've always had. We just have them more intensely now because it's so at the heart of the modern worldview. It's what we're built out of now. And it's so difficult. So this is paragraph 4, and this is what he was talking about. And you can see how there is an interesting resonance that comes from right now. He's talking about modern forms of Christianity and the difficulty of being an authentic Christian in a modern context. And meanwhile, in our primary source reading, we're talking about Paul in the context of the Roman Empire, trying to figure out how can we not be such damn materialists? How can we try to be true to the teachings of Jesus in a context that is encouraging us to see everything as a pie with a limited number of slices we are all supposed to squabble over? It's hard, right? It's difficult. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that thought of ordering back the tide of modernity. What are your chances? Yeah, it's like a steam locomotive coming at you. You could only step out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, that ordering back the tide. My main period of historical study is Anglo-Saxon England, so I know the story of the flogging of the waves, and the modern version of that is we tell, oh, he was so arrogant he thought he could make the tide go back. It's like, no, he was trying to educate his nobles. You guys think the king can do everything. Watch me attempt to tell the tide not to come in. Is it working? I don't think it's working. There's some things I can't control. That's how it is, and it it it's part of why a good deal of what Kenneth Smith is doing is not telling us what a perfect world looks like. He's just trying to help us understand the nature of the trap we're in. And that's an enormous difficulty to communicate to us. I mean, that by itself is a lifetime of work just to get us to get it, to see what it is. But certainly we'll never get out of the trap if we don't understand that we're in one, let alone understand how it works. So the turning back the tide, it's probably for future generations. For us, it's all we can do to figure out how to understand and explain these things.
Well, Ronald Reagan succeeded in doing the very opposite of what he wanted. He wanted, the old time American values to come back. But the opposite occurred. America started borrowing big from the rest of the world. A greater age of materialism evolved.
Yes.
While Ronald's thought he was, taking you back to your old time values.
That's right.
Maybe that was Augustus as well. He thought he could take the Romans back to their old time values.
Yes. And the very next emperor showed no sign of having been aware at all that that was a goal. It's like Tiberius. Nobody would look at Tiberius and go, well, here's a man who understood Augustus's mission.
Well, he did have one good point, Tiberius, prudence, because he was trying to build up a large treasury.
Yes.
For the reason that he saw what happened when they had no money and the Germans destroyed a few legions. They were open. Yes. He was involved in that, and he thought, I want a big treasury so I can, if I have another military disaster, I've got the money.
I'll be ready.
But then came the Roman financial crisis.
Yes.
In 33 AD, and he loosened the purse strings. And that led on to Nero, who began the debasement of the currency.
Right. Right. Yeah, your point about Reagan is very good, and it's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but I should have, because it's such an illustrative example. What we see is when we see that where somebody's working for one thing and instead they achieve the opposite against their intentions. After all the time we spent studying the Greeks, we know that we're in the presence of tragic inversion. There's a tragedy at work here. That's the only way you end up 180 degrees off.
Bush Jr. was a transporter accident. Pinky and the brain were beaming down, and Bush Jr. is a combination of Pinky and the brain.
Yes. Oh, you're full of the insights today. That literally never occurred to me.
It's just beat any of Joe's jokes for the day.
No, I got to tell you, you know what? That is one of my favorite cartoons there, Stephen. So I think we're really on the same page with this book.
This is fantastic.
I just wanted to advance.
Yes, yes. Oh, well, on that note, let's wrap up for this week. We'll do chapter 5 next week, and we will do, let's see. I believe we will be ready to begin Thessalonians next week. So just in time for Sharon.
I just want to make a comment. I put a link in the chat. If you have time, please take a look at the link and just tell me if that person reminds you in any way of our host.
I will.
It's way up the chain of the link. It's from Ginny.
I will have to look at that later. But for
Oh,
now, I
okay.
bid you all a fabulous week.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks, everybody.
That's
Bye,
my
Rick.
nephew
Bye bye, guys.
singing his own song that he
Good evening,
composed.
everyone.
Bye, Donna. See you all
Okay.
next week.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye, Harry. Hi, Stephen.
Don't forget your vitamin B next time.
You know, a lot of Donalds need a little nap during a long meeting.
It's best to turn your camera off.
Oh, well.